They did not arrive to win quickly. They arrived to endure. Across the Pacific, from steaming jungles to shattered ridgelines, one formation learned what it meant to fight until nothing familiar remained. Not just against an enemy, but against heat, hunger, exhaustion, and the slow erosion of certainty itself. This was the War of the 1st Marine Division, a unit that carried the weight of America's first ground offensives and paid for that role with blood, time, and memory. The 1st Marine Division did not inherit momentum. It created it. When the United States went to war in the Pacific, doctrine was unfinished, equipment was imperfect, and experience was limited. The 1st Marine Division was asked to step forward anyway, not because it was ready, but because someone had to be. Guadalcanal was the beginning. The division landed knowing little about what awaited them beyond the beaches. What they found was a campaign defined by uncertainty. Jungle that swallowed sound, night attacks that shattered nerves, disease that claimed men as efficiently as bullets, supplies that arrived late or not at all. There were no clean victories here. Only survival measured in days. Only defense held by exhaustion. Only endurance rewarded by the fact that the enemy finally withdrew. Guadalcanal forged the division's identity, not as an elite symbol, but as a formation that could hold when everything else failed. And then they were sent back in. At Cape Gloucester, rain turned ground into sludge and combat into misery. At Peleliu, the division was fed into one of the most punishing battles of the war, an island fight so brutal that even its necessity would later be questioned. The enemy no longer defended beaches, they defended underground. Every advance cost lives, every position was contested multiple times. The division was worn down and still expected to move forward. By Okinawa, the 1st Marine Division was no longer learning war, it was carrying it. Weeks of constant combat, artillery that never rested, casualties that accumulated without pause. Okinawa was not a battle that tested bravery, it tested limits. Men fought knowing the war's end was visible somewhere beyond the horizon, and that knowledge did not make the fighting easier. If anything, it made every loss heavier. What defines the 1st Marine Division is not a single victory, it is continuity. The same unit that landed early was still fighting late. The same men, or those who replaced them, carried lessons forward at terrible cost. The division evolved because it had to, not because it wanted to. Combined arms improved, coordination sharpened. But none of that erased the fundamental truth of their war. The Pacific demanded persistence, and the 1st Marine Division provided it again and again. Their legacy is not mythology, it is accumulation, of experience earned under fire, of resilience forged in conditions meant to break it, of a standard set, not by speeches, but by survival. The history of the 1st Marine Division is the history of America learning how to fight a war that refused to be quick, clean, or forgiving. Tonight we return to that path. From the first landings to the final campaigns, from uncertainty to grim expertise, to a division that carried the Pacific War forward, one brutal step at a time.
This is the story of the 1st Marine Division.
Before we continue, let me pause for a moment and hear from you. Where in the world are you tuning in from right now, and what time is it for you there? Is this a late-night listen, an early morning start, or a quiet moment carved out just for history? And if these long, steady journeys into the past help you slow down, reflect, or stay grounded, I hope you'll consider subscribing. If this feels like a place you want to return to, then stay with me. Settle in. This is the history of the 1st Marine Division. February 1st, 1941, Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. The morning sun beat down on a patch of coral sand where 7,000 Marines stood in ragged formation, squinting against the glare. Major General Holland Smith raised his hand, and with a single gesture the 1st Marine Division officially came into existence. No bands played, no flags unfurled in dramatic ceremony. The men assembled that morning represented every scattered Marine barracks from Virginia to California, pulled together with such haste that some still wore mismatched uniforms. They had no tanks, insufficient artillery, and barely enough rifles to go around. What they did have was something the United States Army didn't quite understand, and the Imperial Japanese Navy was about to learn the hard way. They had a culture forged in small, brutal wars that America had forgotten, and a belief that being a Marine meant something different than being a soldier. The men standing in that Cuban heat were products of the Great Depression, a generation that had known hunger before they knew combat. They joined for $21 a month and 3 meals a day. not for glory or patriotism, though those would come later. The average age was 21.5 years old. 40% had enlisted between 1933 and 1938, when the economy was still broken and the Corps offered steady pay that farming and factory work couldn't match. They came from Oklahoma Dust Bowls and Pennsylvania coal towns, from Brooklyn tenements and Texas ranches. Most had never seen an ocean before boot camp. Now they stood as the foundation of what would become the most legendary division in Marine Corps history, though nobody that morning could have predicted it. They looked like what they were: young, poor, and entirely expendable in a world racing toward industrial war. The Marine Corps of 1941 occupied a strange position in American military hierarchy. The Army viewed Marines as a specialized regiment, useful for embassy guards and ship detachments, but hardly relevant to modern warfare. The Navy considered them passengers who occasionally provided landing parties. Congress perpetually threatened to absorb the Corps into the Army entirely, questioning why America needed a second land force. The entire Marine Corps numbered only 54,000 men, smaller than many Army divisions. The Corps survived through a combination of bureaucratic stubbornness and a mission nobody else wanted: amphibious assault. While the Army studied tank warfare in Europe and strategic bombing, Marines spent the 1930s developing Doctrine for ship-to-shore attack under fire. They practiced at Culebra and Quantico, refining techniques for landing craft employment, naval gunfire coordination, and beach logistics. It was unglamorous work that produced thick manuals and no headlines. But in a Pacific Ocean studded with Japanese-held islands, that obscure specialty was about to become the only way to win the war. The 1st Marine Division's first commander embodied everything the Corps valued in leadership. Major General Alexander Archer Vandegrift had graduated from the Virginia Military Institute in 1909 and spent his career in the small wars America waged in Central America and the Caribbean. He'd fought Haitian rebels in 1915, hunted Nicaraguan insurgents through jungle mountains in the 1920s, and learned that firepower alone never won guerrilla conflicts. Vandegrift was a scholar warrior, a man who read military history for pleasure and understood that combat was ultimately a contest of human will. He spoke quietly, never cursed, and possessed an unshakable calm that would prove invaluable in the chaos ahead. His Marines called him Sonny Jim for his unfailing courtesy, but behind the genteel manner was a tactical mind that understood the essential truth of infantry combat. You can plan brilliantly, but ultimately victory depends on sergeants and corporals making life-or-death decisions in smoke and confusion. Vandegrift selected his regimental commanders with care, looking for men who combined aggression with steadiness, who could improvise when plans collapsed. Throughout the spring and summer of 1941, the division slowly assembled at its new home, New River, North Carolina, a mosquito-infested stretch of coastal scrubland that would later become Camp Lejeune. The base existed only on paper when the first Marines arrived. They lived in tents and constructed their own barracks, stringing roads through pine forests and building training facilities from lumber milled on site. Equipment arrived in frustrating trickles. The division was authorized 8,000 rifles, but received only 4,800, a mix of World War I-era Springfield bolt-actions and newer M1 Garands. They had 30% of their required radio sets, most of which didn't work reliably. Artillery consisted of World War I vintage French 75s and a handful of newer 105mm howitzers. The division possessed exactly 0 amphibious tractors, the specialized vehicles that Doctrine required for reef crossings. When Marines practiced beach landings, they used wooden boats designed for harbor work, rowing ashore like 18th century sailors. Training focused on the basics because the Corps had no time for sophistication. Marksmanship, small unit tactics, physical conditioning, and the aggressive spirit that separated Marines from soldiers. Drill instructors at Paris Island and San Diego subjected recruits to psychological and physical abuse that today would trigger congressional investigations. They broke men down to component parts, then rebuilt them as Marines who would charge into machine gun fire because their sergeant told them to, and because stopping meant letting down the other Marines in their fire team. It was cult indoctrination disguised as military training, and it worked with disturbing effectiveness. New Marines emerged from boot camp, genuinely believing they were superior to soldiers, sailors, and probably most civilians. This wasn't confidence born of training quality. The Army's infantry courses were arguably better. It was identity, a transformation from individual to member of a warrior brotherhood, that valued honor, courage, and commitment above life itself. Critics called it brainwashing, Marines called it tradition. December 7, 1941, changed everything with shocking speed. When news of Pearl Harbor reached New River, the transformation from training unit to combat force accelerated brutally. The division was still far below authorized strength, still missing critical equipment, still working through basic infantry training. None of that mattered anymore. Marines who joined for steady Depression-era paychecks now faced the certainty of combat against an enemy that had just demonstrated terrifying effectiveness. The Japanese had destroyed America's Pacific battleship fleet in a single morning, seized the Philippines, and were advancing through Southeast Asia with a speed that suggested European colonial powers had vastly underestimated Asian military capability. Suddenly, the Marine Corps' small wars experience seemed quaint. The Japanese weren't Haitian rebels or Nicaraguan guerrillas. They were a first-rate military power with carriers, aircraft, and infantry that had conquered Manchuria and much of China. The 1st Marine Division would have to learn modern warfare while fighting it. Through the winter of 1941 and spring of 1942, the division absorbed replacements and struggled toward combat readiness. The average enlisted Marine now had less than 8 months of training. Officers were predominantly Naval Academy and ROTC graduates with no combat experience. The few veterans of Nicaragua and Haiti found themselves trying to teach lessons from jungle ambushes to Marines who would face coordinated infantry artillery attacks. Training accidents killed and injured men with depressing regularity. Live fire exercises with inexperienced troops and questionable equipment produced casualties before the division ever saw combat. Morale wavered between aggressive confidence, these were Marines after all, and private terror at what lay ahead. Letters home mixed bravado with instructions for distributing personal effects. Chaplains saw attendance surge at services. The men of the 1st Division knew they were going into combat soon. They just didn't know where or when. March 1942 brought the answer and a new commander. Van de Grift received orders to embark the division for the Pacific Theater, and with those orders came a deadline, May 1st. Moving 19,000 Marines, their equipment, supplies, and supporting units across the continent to West Coast ports, then across the Pacific Ocean, represented a logistical challenge the Corps had never attempted. It went badly. Rail transport was chaotic, with units arriving at San Diego and San Francisco separated from their equipment. Ships weren't ready. Critical supplies were still in warehouses on the East Coast. Amphibious landing craft existed in quantities measured in dozens, not hundreds. The division embarked piecemeal through May, boarding converted passenger liners and cargo vessels that smelled of rust and engine oil. Most Marines had never been at sea. Within hours of leaving port, ships became floating misery as men unaccustomed to ocean swells vomited into helmets and over railings. They crossed the Pacific in convoy, watching the California coast disappear and wondering if they'd ever see America again. New Zealand appeared through morning mist in late May 1942, green hills rising from Wellington Harbor like a promised land. The Marines of the 1st Division crowded the rails, grateful beyond measure to see land again after 3 weeks at sea. Wellington was a small city, clean and orderly, populated by people who spoke English with an unfamiliar accent and regarded the arriving Americans with curiosity mixed with hope. New Zealand was isolated, vulnerable, watching Australia's northern coast with growing dread as Japanese forces swept through the Southwest Pacific. The Marines represented protection, proof that America intended to fight in the Pacific rather than write off everything west of Hawaii. Wellingtonians opened their homes and their hearts to the young Americans, offering hospitality that the Marines would remember for the rest of their lives. For a few weeks, it felt almost like a vacation, a chance to recover from the voyage and prepare properly for whatever came next. The men of the 1st Marine Division trained in New Zealand's Green Hills, practiced amphibious landings on quiet beaches, and enjoyed the last moments of peace they would know for a very long time. They didn't know that in Washington and Melbourne, admirals and generals were planning an operation that would commit them to battle in just 67 days, against an enemy none of them could imagine, on an island none of them had heard of, Guadalcanal. May 26, 1942, Wellington, New Zealand. Major General Alexander Van de Grift opened the sealed envelope, delivered by courier, and read the single page twice, certain he'd misunderstood. Operation Watchtower. Seize Guadalcanal and Tulagi in the Solomon Islands. Japanese constructing airfield. Strategic threat to Australia-US supply line. Execute by August 1st. He checked the calendar on his desk, 67 days to prepare for the Marine Corps' first major amphibious assault of the war. His staff had planned on 6 months minimum for training, equipment arrival, and intelligence gathering. They'd just been given 9 weeks, and most of that would be consumed by transit time. Vandegrift walked to the window overlooking Wellington Harbor, where his division's equipment sat in cargo ships, loaded improperly because civilian stevedores had packed them in commercial configuration rather than combat order. Everything needed for the first day of battle, ammunition, water, medical supplies, was buried under equipment that wouldn't be needed for weeks. He would have to unload every ship and reload them properly for combat, in 9 weeks, while also training his division. It was impossible. He would do it anyway. Wellington's docks became a scene of controlled chaos that would define the next 6 weeks. Marines swarmed over cargo ships, hauling supplies onto the docks in driving rain that turned the waterfront into a sea of mud. Combat loading required precise organization. First items off the ship must be first items needed on the beach. Ammunition before tentage, water before clothing, medical supplies before administrative paperwork. The civilian stevedores who'd loaded the ships in San Diego had packed them rationally but useless for assault. Heavy items on the bottom, light items on top, everything organized for easy inventory. For combat, you needed controlled chaos. Landing craft would hit the beach in sequence, and supplies had to match that sequence exactly. The 1st Marine Division essentially unpacked and repacked its entire deployment in the open air of Wellington's docks. New Zealand's autumn rain pounded down. Supplies got wet, crates broke open, tempers flared as exhausted Marines worked 18-hour shifts, manhandling crates that often contained items nobody had ordered, and missing items everyone needed. The equipment situation revealed America's complete unpreparedness for Pacific warfare. The division still lacked enough landing craft to put the first wave ashore simultaneously. They had no amphibious tractors, the specialized vehicles designed to cross coral reefs that surrounded Pacific islands. Intelligence suggested Guadalcanal had reefs, but nobody knew for certain because the maps were tourist-level quality, showing coastlines and river mouths but nothing about beaches, terrain, or Japanese defenses. The Marines would assault using a mix of Higgins boats, wood and steel landing craft that could carry 36 men, and older designs that were even less reliable. If the Japanese contested the beaches, the Marines would hit shore in piecemeal fashion, units scattered, unable to provide mutual support. It was an invitation to slaughter. Vandegrift's operations officer, Colonel Gerald Thomas, ran the numbers and delivered grim news. Best case scenario, they'd get 60% of the assault wave ashore in the first 30 minutes. Worst case, with opposition and mechanical failures, 25%. They would be attacking with a force that might arrive in increments over hours, not minutes. July brought the division's first full rehearsal, and it went catastrophically. Koro Island in Fiji offered beaches, similar to what intelligence suggested for Guadalcanal. On July 28th, the 1st Marine Division would conduct a practice assault to test procedures, timing, and coordination between Navy ships and Marine landing force. The operation was scheduled to commence at 0600 hours. At 0730, landing craft were still circling offshore, unable to find their assigned beaches in morning mist. At 0815, the first wave finally hit shore, badly scattered, with companies intermixed. Half the division never got ashore at all. Boats broke down, ran aground on unseen coral, or simply got lost. Naval gunfire support fell on empty beaches, while Marines waited offshore. Airstrikes bombed coordinates nowhere near the objective. Communications between ships and shore failed completely. Radios got wet during landing and stopped working. By noon, Vandegrift called off the exercise, knowing he'd just witnessed a preview of disaster. His commanders gathered aboard the flagship USS Macaulay that evening, faces grim. Everyone understood what the Koro rehearsal meant. They weren't ready, the Navy wasn't ready, and they were going into combat in 3 days anyway. Intelligence for the Guadalcanal operation barely qualified for the term. The Navy provided aerial reconnaissance photographs, shot from high altitude, showing jungle canopy and coastline, but no detail of beach conditions, terrain features, or enemy positions. A former Australian district officer, who'd lived on Guadalcanal, supplied information from memory, sketching maps of the island's north coast. He remembered a grassy plain suitable for an airfield near Lunga Point, confirming Japanese construction reports. How many Japanese held the island? The estimate ranged from 2,500 to 5,500, but nobody knew for certain. Were they combat troops or labor forces? Unknown. What weapons did they have? Unknown. Where were their defensive positions? Unknown. Marine intelligence officers compiled what they had into briefing packets that officers studied with growing anxiety. One company commander later recalled the intelligence section as basically a tourist brochure with some aerial photos stapled to it. They would hit the beach not knowing if they faced a reinforced regiment dug into bunkers or a construction crew with rifles. The men of the 1st Marine Division spent their final days before embarkation in that peculiar state combat soldiers know well, maintaining equipment with obsessive care while knowing it probably won't matter, writing letters home that carefully avoid revealing anything classified, while trying to say goodbye without admitting it might be final. Private First Class Robert Leckie of the 1st Marines later described watching older Marines sharpen their Ka bar knives with methodical precision, testing edges against thumbnail, resharpening, testing again. Others cleaned rifles that were already spotless, field stripping Garins and Springfields, wiping down every component with oilcloth, reassembling with practiced hands. The division's 3 infantry regiments, 1st, 5th, and 7th Marines, conducted final inspections of weapons, equipment, and personnel. Men who joined during the Depression for steady meals now faced the possibility of violent death on an island most Americans couldn't locate on a map. Some men wrote final letters to be mailed if they died, entrusting them to chaplains who collected dozens of envelopes marked in the event of my death. Others cleaned out personal effects, distributed photographs and valuables among friends with instructions for shipping home. The practical arrangements of mortality. July 31, 1942, the invasion fleet assembled in Phrygian waters, the largest American amphibious force yet gathered in the Pacific. 82 ships, carrying 19,000 Marines and sailors, screened by cruisers and destroyers, covered by 3 aircraft carriers. Aboard the transports, Marines gathered for final briefings. Company commanders spread maps across mess tables, the same inadequate tourist maps they'd been studying for weeks, and reviewed landing assignments. 1st Marines would hit Beach Red near Lunga Point. 5th Marines would land to their left. 7th Marines remained in reserve. Peldal Awe, 800 hours, August 7th. Naval gunfire would prep the beaches for 30 minutes. Airstrikes would suppress any defensive positions. Landing craft would deliver the assault waves in 20-minute intervals. It all sounded professional and coordinated. Everyone aboard ship remembered Coral Island's chaos and wondered if they'd even reach the correct beaches. Vandergrift addressed the division via ship's intercom, his calm voice echoing through metal corridors. He spoke of duty and honor and confidence in their training. He did not mention that they were attempting something the Marine Corps had never successfully done: assault a defended island against an enemy that had just demonstrated its willingness to fight to the death. The night before the invasion, Marines aboard the transports settled into that strange pre-combat state that veterans recognize and no one can adequately describe. Some men slept soundly, the sleep of exhaustion and youth. Others lay awake in their bunks, feeling the ship roll in Pacific swells, listening to the throb of engines, thinking about home and family, and wondering if they'd live through tomorrow. A few compulsively checked equipment one more time. Magazines loaded properly, grenades secured, first aid kit complete. The ship's passageways smelled of sweat and machine oil and the institutional cooking of mass meals. Marines sat in circles playing cards for cigarettes and cash they might not live to spend. Some wrote final letters by flashlight. The more religious attended evening services conducted by chaplains who were themselves frightened but trying not to show it. This was the moment every Marine had trained for and dreaded, the night before going into combat for the first time, when imagination fills darkness with every possible horror and morning seems both inevitable and impossible to reach. August 7th, 0600 hours, the transport area off Guadalcanal's northern coast. Marines climbed down cargo nets into landing craft that rose and fell in ocean swells, trying not to look at the water between ship and boat, where one misstep meant drowning under 60 pounds of equipment. The Higgins boat circled in formation, gathering into waves, churning water white with propeller wash. Inside the boats, Marines sat shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches, feeling the craft rock in swells, smelling gasoline fumes mixed with vomit from men whose fear manifested as motion sickness. Nobody spoke much. What was there to say? The landing craft began their run to shore in ragged lines, bouncing over swells, spray soaking the men in front. Through the open bow ramp, Marines could see Guadalcanal, a dark green mass of jungle rising to mountain ridges, wreathed in morning mist. It looked primeval, untouched, hostile. Naval gunfire screamed overhead, shells impacting inland with crumps felt through the boat's hull. And then as the boats neared shore, something unexpected. Silence. No machine gun fire, no mortar rounds, just the roar of boat engines and the crash of surf. The ramps dropped. Marines stumbled into waist-deep water and waded ashore, weapons ready, expecting death. They found an empty beach. August 7, 1942, 06:41 hours. The ramp of Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's landing craft dropped with a metallic crash, and the first wave of 1st Battalion, 5th Marines splashed into warm tropical water off Guadalcanal's northern coast. Edson led from the front, wading through chest-deep surf with his rifle held high, expecting the water around him to erupt with machine gun fire. He reached the sand, dropped prone, scanned the tree line through his rifle sights. Nothing moved. Behind him, Marines hit the beach in successive waves, spreading out automatically into assault formation, advancing toward the coconut palms that marked the jungle's edge. Still nothing. The beach they designated red was empty, pristine, untouched except for their own boot prints in wet sand. It felt wrong. Every instinct screamed ambush, a trap, Japanese defenders waiting in the jungle to massacre them once they were away from the boats. But as Marines pushed into the tree line, they found only silence broken by birds and the rustle of palm fronds. The most heavily defended beach in the Solomon Islands wasn't defended at all. By 0900 hours, 5,000 Marines were ashore and advancing inland, moving cautiously through coconut groves that showed no sign of enemy presence. The silence was unnerving. Marines who'd steeled themselves for slaughter now fought a different enemy, confusion and anticlimax. Squads moved through plantations in tactical formation, covering each sector, expecting ambush. They found abandoned work camps instead. Near Lunga Point, 1st Marines discovered a Japanese construction site that looked like it had been evacuated minutes earlier. Rice was still warm in cooking pots, work tools lay scattered. A radio played Japanese music to an empty tent. Personal effects, photographs, letters, clothing, littered the ground as if the occupants had fled in panic. The Marines had expected battle. They'd found a ghost town. Staff officers conferred with growing bewilderment. Where were the Japanese? The intelligence estimates had predicted 2,500 to 5,500 enemy soldiers. They couldn't all have simply vanished into the jungle. But as Marines pushed further inland, they encountered no resistance, no defensive positions, no signs of organized defense. It was possible they'd caught the enemy completely by surprise. It was also possible they were walking into an elaborate trap. 1530 hours brought the day's greatest prize and its clearest validation of the entire operation. 1st Marines, advancing southeast along the coast from Red Beach, reached Lunga Point and found exactly what reconnaissance had suggested, an airfield under construction. The runway stretched 3,778 feet, already graded and rolled, 90% complete. Fuel dumps sat alongside the strip, drums of aviation gas stacked in neat rows. Ammunition bunkers held bombs and machine gun rounds for Zero fighters. Heavy construction equipment, road graders, steamrollers, dump trucks stood idle, keys still in the ignition. The Japanese had been building a forward air base that would have put their aircraft within easy range of Australia's supply lines. From this field, Betty bombers could have interdicted every convoy from Hawaii to Brisbane, severing America's lifeline to the Southwest Pacific. The implications were staggering. If the Japanese had completed and operated this airfield, the Allies might have lost the war in the Pacific, and the Marines had captured it intact without firing a shot. Staff officers immediately began calculating, with engineers and Seabees, they could have the field operational in 2 weeks. American fighters and bombers flying from Guadalcanal would control the southern Solomons, reversing the strategic situation. It was an unbelievable stroke of luck. It was also the reason the Japanese would throw everything they had into taking it back. August 8th, afternoon. The Marines' remarkable fortune began its reversal. Admiral Frank Fletcher, commanding the carrier task force providing air cover for the invasion, sent word to Admiral Richmond Turner, commander of the Amphibious force. He was withdrawing the carriers south, out of range of Japanese air attack. Fletcher cited fuel concerns and the vulnerability of his carriers to land-based bombers. Turner protested vehemently. The Marines were ashore but not yet fully supplied. Tons of ammunition, food, engineering equipment, and medical supplies remained aboard the transports. Without carrier air cover, those ships were sitting targets for Japanese bombers. Fletcher was unmoved. The carriers departed south at high speed, taking with them the Marines' shield against air attack. Aboard the transports, Navy cargo crews worked frantically to unload critical supplies before the inevitable Japanese response. They managed to get approximately 30% of the planned supplies ashore before darkness forced a halt. That night, the transport ships sat anchored off Guadalcanal's coast, silhouetted against the tropical night, filled with the food and ammunition the Marines would desperately need. They would never unload the rest. The Battle of Savo Island erupted just after midnight on August 9th and became the worst naval defeat in United States history. Japanese Vice Admiral Genichi Mikawa had raced down the slot, New Georgia Sound, with 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer, reaching Guadalcanal undetected. His force found the Allied screening ships scattered, unprepared, many crews at rest after 2 days of supporting the invasion. What followed was slaughter. Mikawa's cruisers opened fire at close range, their superior night fighting capability overwhelming the Allied ships. USS Astoria took fire from multiple cruisers, burned and sank. USS Quincy took over 30 hits, capsized, and sank. USS Vincennes burned from stem to stern and sank. HMAS Canberra, the Australian cruiser, took 24 hits and had to be scuttled. In less than an hour, Mikawa sank 4 heavy cruisers and damaged 3 more. 1,177 Allied sailors died, most trapped in burning ships or drowned when vessels capsized. The Marines ashore watched the horizon light up with gunfire and explosions, heard the rumble of naval battle, saw ships burning. By dawn, the transport area was empty except for wreckage. The Navy had fled south, taking with them the transports still loaded with supplies. The 1st Marine Division was alone on Guadalcanal, facing an enemy of unknown strength, with approximately 37 days of rations, 40 days of ammunition, and no idea when or if resupply would come. The magnitude of the strategic disaster took days to fully comprehend. Marines ashore had secured their immediate objective, the airfield, but lost their logistical lifeline. The ammunition they'd brought ashore in the first 2 days would have to last until someone figured out how to resupply them. Food was already on strict rationing. Medical supplies were dangerously low. Heavy equipment for finishing the airfield was sitting in cargo holds on ships, now sailing toward New Caledonia. The entire operation had been predicated on Navy control of the seas around Guadalcanal, allowing regular supply convoys. Savo Island had shattered that assumption. The Japanese Navy now controlled the waters around Guadalcanal at night, making resupply convoys suicidal. The Marines were occupying an island they couldn't defend and couldn't supply, facing an enemy that would certainly counterattack. Vandergrift established a defensive perimeter around the airfield, roughly 7 miles wide and 3 miles deep, anchored on the coast and stretching inland to low ridges. It was too large for his undermanned division to defend properly, but too small to provide real security. His Marines began digging in, preparing defensive positions, and wondering how long they'd have to wait for the Japanese response. The mystery of the unopposed landing began resolving through intelligence gathered from the abandoned camps. The Japanese garrison had been primarily a construction force, Korean laborers and Japanese engineers building the airfield, guarded by a light security force. Total personnel on the island at the time of the landing, approximately 2,200, of which only 500 were combat troops. When American ships appeared offshore on the morning of August 7th, the Japanese commander had ordered an immediate evacuation inland to the jungle-covered ridges south of the airfield. It was a rational decision given his force composition. He couldn't defend the beach with construction workers. He'd planned to withdraw to prepared positions in the interior and wait for reinforcement from Rabaul. What he hadn't anticipated was that the Marines would stay. Japanese doctrine assumed that American forces would conduct a raid, destroy the airfield, and withdraw, not an occupation. The Japanese command at Rabaul spent the first days after the landing trying to understand American intentions. Once they realized the Marines intended to hold Guadalcanal, the Imperial Japanese Navy began planning a counteroffensive. The captured airfield became the focal point of everything that would follow. Navy Seabees and Marine engineers worked around the clock to complete the runway using captured Japanese equipment and improvised methods. They filled craters from naval gunfire, extended the graded surface, and constructed taxiways using perforated steel planking called Marston matting. By August 12th, exactly 5 days after the landing, the field was operational enough for emergency landings. On August 20th, the first American aircraft arrived, 19 Wildcat fighters of Marine Fighting Squadron 223 and 12 Dauntless dive bombers of Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 232. The Marines christened the field Henderson Field in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, killed at the Battle of Midway. Those 31 aircraft became the division's lifeline. With air cover, supply ships could reach Guadalcanal during daylight. Without it, the division would starve. The Japanese understood this perfectly. Every subsequent battle on Guadalcanal revolved around Henderson Field, the Marines fighting to keep it operational, the Japanese trying to recapture or destroy it. The field was more than an airstrip. It was the strategic hinge on which the entire Pacific War would turn. The Marines settled into their perimeter with a growing sense that they'd been abandoned. No word came from higher command about reinforcement or relief. Radio communications with rear areas were sporadic at best. Supply ships appeared occasionally during daylight, unloaded hurriedly, and departed before nightfall to avoid Japanese naval forces. The division went on 2/3 rations. Marines supplemented their diet with captured Japanese rice and whatever they could forage from abandoned gardens. The first cases of malaria appeared. Dengue fever followed. Dysentery spread through units living in jungle conditions without proper sanitation. The tropical climate that had seemed beautiful on landing day became oppressive. Humidity that kept uniforms perpetually damp, heat that sapped energy, rain that turned foxholes into mud pits. At night, Japanese bombers appeared with predictable regularity, dropping bombs on Henderson Field and the perimeter. The Marines called the lone harassing bomber Louis the Louse and Washing Machine Charlie for the distinctive sound of its unsynchronized engines. The bombing caused few casualties, but destroyed sleep, leaving Marines exhausted and on edge. This was the reality of holding Guadalcanal, not heroic charges or dramatic battles, but grinding attrition, waiting for an enemy that was certainly coming, wondering if they'd have the strength to fight when he arrived. August 20th brought the first test. Japanese Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki landed at Taivu Point, 20 miles east of the Marine perimeter, with 917 men of the Ichiki detachment. His mission, reconnaissance in force to determine American strength, followed by destruction of the Marine garrison. Ichiki was a veteran of combat in China and the Malayan campaign, confident in Japanese superiority and contemptuous of American fighting ability. His intelligence briefings suggested the Marines numbered perhaps 2,000 men, dispirited and weakly defending the airfield. Actual Marine strength, 11,000 men, dug into prepared defensive positions, equipped with heavy machine guns and artillery, and absolutely determined not to be driven off the island. Ichiki approached from the east, moving at night, his force traveling light with only basic weapons and minimal supplies. He expected a quick fight, followed by a glorious victory. What he found instead, waiting in the darkness along a muddy stream the Marines had misidentified as the Tenaru River, was about to teach both sides what this war would truly be like. The unopposed landing at Red Beach had been an illusion. The real battle for Guadalcanal was about to begin, and it would be unlike anything either side had experienced. August 21st, 1942, 0130 hours. Private First Class John Rivers of Company L, 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, sat in his foxhole on the west bank of the Ilu River, misidentified on maps as the Tenaro, listening to the jungle breathe. The night was ink black, moonless, the kind of darkness where you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Rivers had been in position for 3 hours, taking his turn on watch while his foxhole partner tried to sleep. The defensive line stretched along the riverbank, 1st Battalion holding a 1,000-yard front with interlocking fields of fire from M1917 Browning machine guns, sighted to cover the sandbar where the river met the ocean. Intelligence had reported Japanese patrols in the area. Every Marine along the line knew something was coming. At 0131, Rivers heard it, a rhythmic sound growing louder, resolving into human voices chanting in unison. Then the darkness beyond the river erupted with screaming, hundreds of voices yelling "Banzai," and the sound of men splashing through shallow water. Rivers opened fire into the darkness, his M1 Garand spitting 8-round clips as fast as he could reload, aiming at muzzle flashes and the sound of movement. The Battle of the Tenaru had begun. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's 917-man assault force hit the Marine line in a formation that would have been effective against Chinese troops or colonial forces. A dense frontal charge designed to overwhelm defenders through shock and numbers. Against Marines in prepared positions with heavy weapons, it was suicide. Ichiki's men charged across the sandbar four abreast, bayonets fixed, screaming their battle cry, convinced of victory. The 1st Battalion's machine guns opened fire simultaneously, disciplined bursts that turned the sandbar into a killing zone. Tracers arced across the river, every 5th round glowing red, marking lines of fire that cut through the charging Japanese like scythes through wheat. Marines had registered their machine guns on key terrain during daylight, marking ranges with stakes, creating overlapping zones where nothing could live. The Japanese charged into those zones and died in windrows. Some made it across the river, cutting through barbed wire with remarkable speed, infiltrating between Marine positions. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted in foxholes. Marines using bayonets, knives, and entrenching tools against Japanese soldiers, who fought with fanatical determination. Private Rivers killed 3 Japanese soldiers at arm's length before dawn, 02:30 hours. The intensity of the assault shocked the Marines. The Japanese didn't withdraw when they took casualties. They didn't even slow down. Men shot multiple times continued advancing until they physically collapsed. Others, wounded and unable to stand, crawled forward with grenades, trying to reach Marine positions. It was a type of combat unknown in the American military tradition, an enemy that viewed death in battle as the highest honor and surrender as unthinkable shame. Marines shot Japanese soldiers who played dead, then attacked from behind. They shot soldiers who raised their hands as if surrendering, then threw grenades. Trust evaporated. The Marines developed a simple rule: if it moved, shoot it. The fighting devolved into primitive savagery, a darkness lit only by muzzle flashes and the occasional flare, filled with screaming in 2 languages and the wet sounds of men dying violently. This wasn't the war anyone had imagined. This was industrial age killing delivered with Stone Age hatred. Dawn on August 21st revealed the scale of the slaughter. The sandbar and the riverbank beyond were carpeted with Japanese bodies, in some places stacked 3 deep. Marines emerging from their positions in morning light stared at the carnage they'd inflicted. Hundreds of dead Japanese soldiers lay in grotesque positions, some still clutching rifles, others tangled in barbed wire where they died trying to cut through. The smell of blood and excrement, bowels voiding at death, mixed with cordite smoke and tropical vegetation. Many Marines vomited, others sat in their foxholes shaking, processing what they'd just survived. 1st Battalion's commander, Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock, walked the line assessing casualties, 35 dead, 75 wounded. Then he looked across the river at the estimated 774 Japanese dead. The math was stark, a 22-to-1 kill ratio. If all future battles went like this, the Marines would win the war. But the cost of Tenaru wasn't measured just in bodies. Every Marine who'd fought that night had learned that their enemy would literally rather die than retreat, which meant this war would be a war of annihilation. 0900 hours brought the coup de grace. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell led 1st Battalion, 1st Marines in an envelopment maneuver, swinging wide to approach the Japanese position from the flank, while 5 M2A4 light tanks from Company A, 1st Tank Battalion, attacked from a different angle. The Japanese survivors, perhaps 200 men, had withdrawn to a coconut grove and prepared to die fighting. The Marines gave them their wish. The light tanks rumbled through the grove, their 37mm guns and machine guns systematically destroying Japanese positions. Infantry followed, clearing the grove with grenades and rifle fire. The Japanese fought to the end. Only 15 prisoners were taken, all of them unconscious from wounds. Every other Japanese soldier died. Marines found Colonel Ichiki's body near his regimental colors, a sword wound to the abdomen suggesting suicide rather than surrender. His personal diary, retrieved from his effects, revealed the operation's stunning miscalculation. Ichiki had believed he faced 2,000 dispirited American troops. He'd attacked 11,000 combat-ready Marines with less than 1,000 men. It was worse than a tactical failure. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy's capabilities and will to fight. The aftermath of Tenaru established patterns that would define the Pacific War. Marines began treating Japanese corpses with wary respect, checking each body for grenades or weapons before approaching, shooting any that showed signs of movement. They learned that wounded Japanese soldiers would detonate grenades when Marines tried to provide medical aid, killing their rescuers. Bushido, the warrior code that prized honor and death over surrender, wasn't just propaganda, it was real, and it made conventional warfare rules obsolete. The Geneva Convention assumed soldiers would surrender when defeated. The Japanese viewed surrender as the ultimate dishonor, preferring death or suicide. This created a terrible logic. Marines couldn't take prisoners because Japanese soldiers wouldn't surrender, and Japanese soldiers wouldn't surrender because they believed Americans killed prisoners. Both sides fought with escalating brutality, each action justifying the other's atrocities. American press reports of the Tenaru battle focused on the lopsided casualty ratio and Marine heroism. They didn't mention that Marines had learned to kill systematically, to treat every enemy soldier as a threat regardless of condition, to view combat as extermination rather than conflict. The Marines who fought at Tenaru returned to their positions fundamentally changed. They'd entered the battle as Americans with various backgrounds and beliefs. They emerged as members of a warrior cult that had proven its superiority in the most ancient test, close combat to the death. The psychological impact cut both ways. The division gained confidence from the victory. Individual Marines carried trauma they couldn't articulate to anyone who hadn't been there. How do you explain shooting a wounded man who was crawling toward you? How do you describe the sound of machine guns firing continuously for 30 minutes into densely packed human targets? How do you sleep after watching men die by the hundreds? The Marines didn't talk about it. They cleaned their weapons, checked their ammunition, and waited for the next attack. For the Japanese, Tenaru was a disaster that should have prompted strategic reassessment. It didn't. Imperial headquarters in Tokyo received reports of the engagement that minimized the defeat and blamed Ichiki's tactics rather than questioning the entire approach. The belief in Japanese spiritual superiority over materialistic Americans remained unshaken. If Ichiki failed, it was because he'd been rash, not because Americans could fight. The solution was obvious: send more troops with better coordination, overwhelm the Marines through superior numbers and fighting spirit. This logic would drive Japanese strategy for the next 4 months, feeding reinforcements piecemeal into Guadalcanal in a series of attacks that would slaughter Japanese soldiers by the thousands while the Marines bled slowly from attrition, disease, and exhaustion. Tenaru established the pattern. It wasn't the largest or bloodiest battle of the Guadalcanal campaign, but it was the first moment when both sides truly understood what kind of war this would be. Total, merciless, fought to the last man. The tactical lessons from Tenaru shaped Marine Corps doctrine for the rest of the war. Defensive positions should be mutually supporting with interlocking fields of fire. Heavy machine guns were decisive in stopping mass infantry assaults. Artillery, when available, could break attacks before they reached the line. Most importantly, hold your ground, don't panic. Maintain fire discipline. The Marines had done all these things instinctively or through good leadership. Now those instincts became codified doctrine. Every Marine arriving on Guadalcanal learned about Tenaru, about the importance of fields of fire and mutual support. They learned that Japanese would attack at night, would infiltrate between positions, would use surprise and shock to break defensive lines. They learned that survival depended on staying in position, trusting the Marines on their flanks, and killing the enemy faster than he could kill you. Simple lessons purchased with blood. The river the Marines called the Tenaru, actually the Ilu, became the first of many geographic names that would resonate through Marine Corps history. Tenaru, Bloody Ridge, the Matanakau, Coffin Corner. Each name a reminder of battles fought in jungle darkness against an enemy who preferred death to defeat. The 1st Marine Division was accumulating an oral history built on shared horror. Victories so hard fought they felt like defeats. Survival through combination of skill and luck. The men who fought at Tenaru gained status as combat veterans, their opinions carrying weight in the continuous arguments about tactics and equipment that filled the quiet hours between battles. They'd proven themselves in the ultimate test. They'd stared at human beings across a few dozen yards of darkness and pulled triggers until those human beings stopped moving. It was murder, it was war, it was necessary, and it would happen again and again until one side or the other ran out of soldiers willing to die on this miserable island that most Americans couldn't locate on a map. Guadalcanal had become the place where the Pacific War would be decided, and the 1st Marine Division, willing or not, ready or not, was committed to seeing it through to the end, whatever that end might be. August 28, 1942, 1400 hours. High on a jungle ridge on Bougainville Island, Australian coast watcher Paul Mason pressed field glasses to his eyes and counted aircraft. 25, 30, 40 bombers emerging from clouds over Rabaul, heading southeast on a bearing that could only mean one destination, Guadalcanal. Mason ducked into his concealed shelter, a tent camouflaged with vegetation, undetectable from air, and cranked the handle on his teleradio. The encoded message tapped out in Morse code, 45 bombers heading yours. It would reach Ken, the call sign for Allied headquarters, in seconds. From there, the warning would be relayed to Henderson Field, in time for Marine fighters to scramble and meet the bombers at altitude. Mason's report would save dozens of American lives this afternoon. The Japanese didn't know he existed, that their bombers were being tracked from takeoff by a network of observers scattered across the Solomon Islands, Australian and New Zealand servicemen who'd stayed behind when the islands fell, who lived in the jungle and radioed intelligence while Japanese forces hunted them. The Coast Watchers were the unseen advantage that let the Marines survive on Guadalcanal. Without them, Henderson Field would have been destroyed in the first week. The Coast Watcher network represented one of the Pacific War's most successful intelligence operations, and almost nobody knew it existed. 700 observers operated across the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Bismarck Archipelago, organized by the Australian Royal Navy before the war as an early warning system. They were planters, colonial officials, missionaries, and adventurers who knew the islands intimately and chose to stay when Japanese forces advanced south. They built concealed observation posts on high ground, maintained radio contact with Allied headquarters, and provided continuous intelligence on Japanese ship and aircraft movements. The Japanese knew someone was transmitting intelligence. Radio direction-finding equipment detected the broadcasts, but hunting Coast Watchers in thousands of square miles of jungle proved nearly impossible. A few were captured and executed. Most survived through mobility and help from local islanders who served as scouts and porters. The Coast Watchers' intelligence let Henderson Field's fighters scramble in time to gain altitude advantage. It warned of Japanese naval movements down the slot. It provided the early warning system that kept the Marines from being surprised the way Pearl Harbor had been surprised. And it operated in complete obscurity, known only to headquarters staff and the pilots whose lives it saved daily. The slot knew Georgia Sound became the arena where the Guadalcanal campaign was really fought. The narrow passage between island chains ran northwest from Guadalcanal toward Rabaul, Japanese headquarters for the South Pacific. Control the slot meant control of resupply, reinforcement, and bombardment. The Japanese Navy turned the slot into a highway, running fast destroyer and cruiser groups south at night, delivering troops and supplies to Guadalcanal, then racing back north before dawn, when American aircraft from Henderson Field could attack. The Marines called these nocturnal runs the Tokyo Express, or Rat Run, watching helplessly from shore as Japanese ships unloaded reinforcements east of the perimeter, bombarded Henderson Field, and escaped before the Navy could intervene. The Express ran with frustrating regularity. August 28th, 4 destroyers delivered Colonel Kiyotaki Oka and 900 troops of the Ichiki Detachment's main body. September 4th, 3 destroyers and 3 patrol boats delivered 1,200 men of the Kawaguchi Brigade. September 8th, 2 destroyer transports delivered 290 troops. Each run degraded the Marines' numerical advantage, building Japanese strength while the 1st Division remained static, waiting for reinforcements that never seemed to arrive. The Tokyo Express revealed the fundamental problem with the Guadalcanal operation. Neither side could establish permanent control of the waters around the island. During daylight, American air power from Henderson Field made the slot a death trap for Japanese ships. Betty bombers and Wildcat fighters sank transports and damaged warships with enough regularity that the Japanese abandoned slow convoy movements in favor of fast destroyer runs. But at night, the Japanese Navy owned the waters. American ships lacked the night fighting capability, radar, trained doctrine, aggressive commanders to challenge Japanese destroyers and cruisers that had spent years perfecting nocturnal warfare. The result was strategic stalemate. Neither side could knock the other off the island, neither could resupply adequately. Both were trapped in an attrition battle where victory meant outlasting the enemy's will to continue. The Marines on Guadalcanal were hostages to this strategic deadlock, watching the Tokyo Express deliver fresh enemy troops while their own reinforcement trickled in sporadically. September 12th brought a new horror: battleship bombardment. The Japanese had tried destroyers and cruisers without success at neutralizing Henderson Field. Now they escalated to capital ships. The battleships Congo and Haruna raced down the slot, arriving off Guadalcanal at 0200 hours, and opened fire with their 14-inch main batteries. Each gun fired shells weighing over 1,400 pounds. The battleships fired 747 rounds in 83 minutes. The Marines called it Dugout Sunday because everyone who could find a dugout or bunker was in it, huddling while the earth shook from impacts. Henderson Field took direct hits that cratered the runway, destroyed aircraft, obliterated fuel dumps, and killed 41 men. By dawn, the field looked like the surface of the moon. Japanese intelligence estimated it would take weeks to repair. Navy Seabees and Marine engineers had it operational in 6 hours, using Marston matting to bridge craters and improvise repairs on damaged aircraft. 48 of 71 planes were destroyed or damaged, but enough survived to fly. The Tokyo Express had demonstrated it could hurt Henderson Field, but couldn't destroy it, which meant the strategic stalemate continued. The submarine resupply runs showed Japanese desperation and ingenuity. When surface ships proved too vulnerable to air attack, the Japanese Navy began using submarines to deliver critical supplies. I-class submarines would surface after dark off Guadalcanal's coast, transfer rubber boats loaded with ammunition, medical supplies, and food to shore parties, and submerge before dawn. It was slow, inefficient, and dangerous. Several submarines were lost to American patrols, but it worked. The Marines watched in frustration as Japanese troops received reinforcement and supply despite Henderson Field's dominance of daytime waters. The submarine runs demonstrated a truth both sides were learning. Island warfare in the Pacific would be won by logistics, by whichever side could sustain its forces through the grinding attrition of combat, disease, and isolation. Tactical victories like Tenero mattered less than the daily mathematics of supplies delivered, casualties evacuated, replacements arrived. The Coastwatcher network provided one more critical function beyond early warning: coastwatching for downed pilots and isolated Marines. When a fighter was shot down over water or behind Japanese lines, coastwatchers coordinated rescue missions, guiding Allied submarines or PT boats to pick up points. They sheltered downed airmen, fed them, and arranged extraction. Lieutenant Junior Grade George Gay, shot down at Midway, survived behind Japanese lines for months, thanks to Coastwatcher support. Dozens of others owed their lives to Australians and New Zealanders who risked execution to save Allied personnel. This humanitarian function built loyalty between Coastwatchers and the men they protected. Marine pilots flying from Henderson Field knew that if they went down over the Solomons, someone was out there trying to bring them home. That knowledge made them more willing to press attacks, knowing that mechanical failure or combat damage didn't mean automatic death or capture. The Coastwatchers provided hope, a lifeline back to friendly territory, and that hope was worth divisions in terms of morale. By October 1942, the Tokyo Express had delivered approximately 15,000 Japanese troops to Guadalcanal, transforming the campaign from a raid that went wrong into a major battle of strategic significance. The Marines' numerical advantage had evaporated. The 1st Division now faced an enemy force roughly equal in size, better supplied in some categories, and operating from interior lines. Japanese forces held the jungle-covered ridges south of Henderson Field, could observe Marine positions, and could choose when and where to attack. The Marines held a perimeter that was too large to defend adequately with available forces, anchored on an airfield that was under constant bombardment and attack. Both sides were exhausted, sick, and running low on supplies. The strategic question wasn't who would win, it was who would collapse first. The Tokyo Express had made that race competitive. Every destroyer that unloaded troops without being sunk meant the Japanese gained ground in the attrition calculation. Every night bombardment that damaged Henderson Field bought the Japanese time. The slot had become the supply line that neither side could sever, and until someone found a way to dominate those waters completely, Guadalcanal would remain the Pacific War's bleeding ulcer. The Marines developed a bitter respect for the Tokyo Express and the men who ran it. Japanese destroyer crews demonstrated exceptional seamanship, navigating the slot at high speed in darkness, conducting complex unloading operations under pressure, evading American air patrols. Marine raiders watching from shore saw Japanese destroyers approach at 30 knots, brake hard, launch landing craft, unload troops and supplies in 20 minutes, and be gone before American forces could react. It was professional, efficient, and nearly impossible to counter with available assets. The Marines had no fast patrol boats until PT boats arrived in October. The Navy's cruisers and destroyers were too slow, too cautious, and repeatedly outfought in night engagements where Japanese torpedoes and gunfire proved superior to American doctrine. The Tokyo Express ran because the United States Navy couldn't stop it, a humiliating admission for a service that prided itself on sea control. The Marines on Guadalcanal bore the cost of that failure, watching enemy reinforcements arrive while they slowly starved. The final indignity was Louis the Louse and Washing Machine Charlie, the nicknames Marines gave to Japanese float planes that appeared nightly over Henderson Field. These were observation aircraft, not bombers, but their function was clear: drop flares over the field and the marine perimeter, marking targets for the battleships and cruisers offshore. When Louis appeared, Marines knew they had minutes to find shelter before shells started falling. The psychological impact exceeded the physical damage. Nobody could sleep through bombardment, which meant Marines went days without real rest, accumulating exhaustion that degraded combat effectiveness. The nightly ritual, Louis's appearance, the scramble for cover, the concussive impacts of naval shells became another form of attrition, wearing down the division through constant stress. The Tokyo Express wasn't just a supply line, it was a weapon, a systematic campaign to destroy Henderson Field and the Marines defending it through overwhelming firepower and relentless pressure. And for months, it almost worked. September 12, 1942, 2100 hours. Colonel Merritt Edson stood on a nameless ridge, 1,300 yards south of Henderson Field, studying the jungle below through binoculars as darkness gathered. His command, 840 Marines from 1st Raider Battalion and 1st Parachute Battalion, occupied positions along this low coral spine that ran perpendicular to the coast. It wasn't an impressive piece of terrain, 100 feet high at most, covered in kunai grass and scattered trees, barely worthy of being called a hill. But it was the last barrier between Japanese forces assembling in the jungle and Henderson Field itself. Intelligence reported that Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi had landed 3,000 men via Tokyo Express over the past week, all converging on the southern perimeter. Edson had studied the terrain and recognized this ridge as the logical avenue of attack. It offered covered approach from the jungle, a direct route to the airfield, and if the Japanese took it, they'd command observation over the entire marine perimeter. He'd positioned his raiders and paratroopers here 3 days ago, dug them in, registered artillery concentrations, and waited. Tonight, he knew Kawaguchi would come. 21:30 hours, the jungle erupted. Japanese infantry emerged from the tray line in company strength, moving in infiltration formation, small groups advancing independently, seeking gaps in the marine line. This wasn't the banzai charge of Tenaru. Kawaguchi had studied that disaster and adapted. His men used tactics perfected in China: probe for weaknesses, infiltrate through gaps, attack from multiple directions simultaneously to create confusion. The Marines opened fire, rifles and machine guns cutting down the first wave. More Japanese appeared, coming from different angles, slipping between positions. A gap opened in the raider line, where 2 companies failed to maintain contact. Japanese infantry poured through, getting behind Marine positions, attacking from the rear. By 2200 hours, the ridge crest was contested, Marines and Japanese fighting in darkness, lit only by muzzle flashes and the occasional grenade burst. Edson's command post came under direct attack. Marines fought hand-to-hand with Japanese soldiers who'd infiltrated to within yards of the battalion headquarters. The line was breaking. 0200 hours, September 13th. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. The raiders had fallen back from the ridge crest, giving up hard-won ground, trying to form a coherent defensive line on the reverse slope. Japanese infiltration had created chaos. Marines were shooting at sounds and shadows, unable to distinguish friend from enemy in darkness. Friendly fire casualties mounted as nervous troops engaged anything that moved. Radio communications broke down as operators were killed or equipment was destroyed. Individual companies lost contact with battalion headquarters. The parachute battalion on the left flank reported being overrun. Edson moved through his collapsing perimeter, physically placing Marines in position, his calm presence stopping the beginnings of panic. He found Sergeant Major Jacob Vasa, a native scout who'd been captured by the Japanese, bayoneted repeatedly, and left for dead, yet had crawled back to Marine lines to deliver intelligence about Kawaguchi's attack plan. Vasa was still trying to help despite wounds that should have killed him. His courage shamed Marines who were considering retreat. 3:30 hours brought the moment that defined Merritt Edson as a combat leader and saved Henderson Field. The Marine line had contracted to a final ridge position, barely 400 yards from the airfield. Japanese forces controlled the original defensive positions and were preparing for a final assault that would break through to Henderson Field. Edson gathered what remained of his command, perhaps 500 effective Marines from the original 840, and addressed them in darkness. His voice carried quiet intensity. "The only thing the Japs have that you don't is guts. They're going to come again, but we're going to hold." It wasn't eloquence, it was statement of fact delivered by a man who would die on this ridge before retreating. The Marines heard him and believed. When Kawaguchi's next assault came, screaming Japanese infantry charging upslope, the raiders and paratroopers held their ground and killed everything that reached their positions. Machine guns fired until barrels glowed red. Riflemen shot until their shoulders were bruised from recoil. And the Japanese came on, wave after wave, dying on the slopes but never breaking through. Dawn on September 13th revealed a battlefield that shocked even veterans of Tenaru. Japanese bodies covered the ridge slopes, concentrated in draws and ravines where they'd tried to mass for assaults. Marines counted 850 dead Japanese soldiers in the immediate defensive area, with blood trails suggesting hundreds more had been dragged away by retreating forces. The 11th Marines, the division's artillery regiment, had fired 1,992 rounds during the night, mostly in pre-registered defensive fires that Edson had planned days earlier. Those concentrations had broken multiple Japanese charges before they reached the Marine line. The artillery had been decisive, perhaps more so than the infantry defense. But it was Edson's tactical judgment, positioning his force on this particular ridge, registering artillery in advance, maintaining calm during crisis, that had created conditions for victory. The Marines had held by approximately 50 yards. If the Japanese had broken through at 0400 hours instead of 0330, they would have reached Henderson Field. The battle had been that close. The human cost was severe on both sides, but dramatically asymmetric. The raiders and paratroopers lost 59 killed and 204 wounded, nearly a third of the engaged force. Japanese losses exceeded 1,000 killed and unknown wounded, perhaps another 500. Kawaguchi's brigade had been shattered as a fighting force. But the casualty numbers didn't capture the psychological dimension. The Marines had faced sophisticated tactics delivered by well-trained troops and prevailed through combination of firepower, leadership, and sheer determination not to yield ground. They'd proven that Japanese infantry wasn't invincible, that infiltration tactics could be defeated by alert defenders with artillery support. The battle validated Marine Corps doctrine about defensive operations: hold key terrain, maintain unit cohesion, employ supporting arms effectively. These principles seemed obvious in training. Edson's Ridge proved they worked in combat against a skilled enemy executing a coordinated night attack. The ridge acquired its name through a typical Marine process, combining location with blood. It had been a nameless terrain feature on maps. After September 13th, it was Edson's Ridge, a name that carried pride and horror in equal measure. The men who fought there gained status in the division's informal hierarchy. They'd been tested in sustained close combat and hadn't broken. That mattered in a way that garrison duty or patrolling never could. Marines who missed the battle listened to survivors' stories with mixture of relief and envy. Relief at having avoided that particular hell, envy at not being able to claim they'd been there. This was the peculiar psychology of combat units, where shared suffering created bonds stronger than friendship, and everyone wanted to prove themselves in the ultimate test. Edson's Ridge became the standard by which subsequent battles would be measured. The strategic implications extended far beyond one night's fighting. Kawaguchi's attack represented the Japanese High Command's best effort to recapture Henderson Field through ground assault. They'd massed forces, employed sophisticated tactics, achieved tactical surprise in the approach, and still failed catastrophically. Imperial headquarters in Rabaul had to confront an uncomfortable truth. American Marines in prepared defensive positions couldn't be dislodged by infantry assault, even at overwhelming numerical odds. The Japanese would try again. Their strategic situation demanded it, but the confidence that had characterized early operations was gone. After Edson's Ridge, Japanese planning for Guadalcanal shifted from when we recapture the airfield to how many troops will it take. That shift from confidence to calculation marked the psychological turning point of the campaign, even though months of fighting remained. The 11th Marines emerged from Edson's Ridge with enhanced reputation for precision and responsiveness. Artillery and jungle warfare faced unique challenges. Limited observation, dense vegetation that degraded effectiveness of air bursts, difficulty moving guns in terrain where roads didn't exist. The 11th had overcome these obstacles through aggressive forward observer placement and meticulous pre-registration of defensive fires. They'd identified every avenue of approach to key positions, calculated firing data in advance, and could place shells on target within seconds of a fire mission call. At Edson's Ridge, this preparation paid off spectacularly. Japanese forces advancing in column through jungle ravines walked into artillery concentrations that killed dozens at a time. The survivors who reached the Marine line were already depleted and disorganized. American artillery wouldn't always be this decisive. Terrain and ammunition shortages limited its employment, but Edson's Ridge demonstrated what was possible when artillery and infantry worked in close coordination. The battle's aftermath revealed the physical toll that sustained combat extracted from human bodies. The raiders and paratroopers had fought for nearly 12 hours of darkness, most of it at maximum stress, firing thousands of rounds, throwing hundreds of grenades, engaging in hand-to-hand combat. When dawn came and the adrenaline faded, Marines collapsed where they stood. Some slept for 16 hours straight despite Japanese air raids. Others couldn't sleep at all, replaying the night's action, starting at sudden noises. Corpsmen treated wounds that men hadn't noticed during combat. Bayonet cuts, shrapnel injuries, concussions from grenades. The division's medical officer noted a spike in what would later be called combat stress reaction. Marines with no physical injuries, but exhibiting tremors, inability to speak, catatonic stares. The Corps had no doctrine for handling psychological casualties. Commanders sent them to the rear for rest, and hoped they'd recover. Some did. Others never fully returned to duty. The invisible wounds of Edson's Ridge would haunt survivors for decades. September 14th brought the inevitable Japanese response: aerial bombardment and naval gunfire, attempting to destroy Henderson Field in retaliation for the ground defeat. The pattern was now familiar. Japanese couldn't take the field by assault, so they'd try to render it unusable through bombardment, then land reinforcements and try again. The Tokyo Express would run again, delivering fresh troops to replace the dead from Edson's Ridge. The strategic stalemate continued, measured in nightly bombardments and daily air raids, each side unable to land the decisive blow. But something fundamental had changed after Edson's Ridge. The Marines knew they could hold against any Japanese ground assault. The Japanese knew that ground assault alone wouldn't recapture Henderson Field. Both sides were trapped in a war of attrition, where victory meant outlasting the enemy's will to continue, and neither side was ready to quit. The ridge that Merritt Edson had defended so stubbornly became the pivot point around which the entire Guadalcanal campaign would turn. The Japanese would try again, they had to, but they would never again come so close to breaking through. And the 1st Marine Division, having survived its greatest test, now faced a different enemy: time, disease, and the slow grinding exhaustion of holding ground while the rest of the world moved on. September 20th, 1942. The 1st Medical Battalion's aid station near Lunga Point processed its 1100th malaria case of the month. Corpsmen watched another Marine stumble in, shivering despite the 90-degree heat, skin yellowish from fever, barely able to walk. The corpsman on duty took his temperature, 103.8 degrees, administered quinine from dwindling supplies, and tagged him for evacuation if transport became available. Evacuation rarely became available. The sick Marine would spend 3 days in a cot, under canvas, sweating through fever cycles, then return to his unit still sick because the division needed every man who could carry a rifle. By late September 1962, Marines were on sick call daily, out of a division strength of approximately 11,000. Nearly 70% had contracted malaria. The enemy killing the 1st Marine Division wasn't the Imperial Japanese Army. It was Anopheles mosquitoes breeding in jungle swamps and coral pools. Combat inflicted casualties in dramatic surges. Tenaru, Edson's Ridge, but disease ground down the division remorselessly, every single day without respite. The mathematics were brutal. At current rates, the division would be combat ineffective by mid-November even if the Japanese never attacked again. Malaria came in 2 strains, both endemic to Guadalcanal. Plasmodium vivax produced recurring fever cycles, weakness, and exhaustion, but rarely killed. Plasmodium falciparum cerebral malaria killed approximately 15% of infected patients through brain hemorrhaging, kidney failure, or shock. The Marines had neither enough quinine to treat all cases, nor enough atabrine to prevent infection. Medical supplies that should have been unloaded in the first days of the operation were still aboard transports that had fled south after Savo Island. Corpsmen rationed quinine tablets, prioritizing severe cases, watching men with mild malaria symptoms worsen into crisis because treatment came too late. The division medical officer filed reports that read like disaster scenarios: 3,283 disease hospitalizations versus 1,472 combat casualties through October. More Marines were being evacuated for disease than wounds, and the ones who stayed were operating at diminished capacity, weakened by recurring fever, unable to maintain full combat effectiveness. Dysentery followed malaria as the second great killer. The Marines lived in tropical heat without proper sanitation facilities, drinking water from streams that might be contaminated, eating food prepared in conditions that violated every hygiene standard. Intestinal parasites spread through units with predictable efficiency. Amoebic dysentery produced bloody diarrhea, severe cramping, and rapid dehydration. Marines lost 15 to 20 pounds in a week. Some became so weak they couldn't stand without assistance. The division established field latrines, essentially holes in the ground with wooden seats, but maintaining sanitary discipline in combat conditions proved impossible. Men on patrol couldn't walk 50 yards to a latrine when Japanese snipers controlled the jungle. Units on the perimeter stayed in foxholes for days, using helmets for waste. Flies bred in unimaginable numbers, carrying disease from waste to food. Corpsmen tried to enforce sanitary procedures, but were fighting biology in an environment perfectly designed for pathogen transmission. Fungal infections attacked every Marine exposed to constant moisture. Jungle rot manifested as ringworm, severe athlete's foot, and tropical ulcers that ate through skin to expose muscle and bone. The Marines' boots, designed for temperate climates, stayed wet permanently in Guadalcanal's humidity and daily rains. Feet softened, skin broke down, fungal infections took hold. Corpsmen treated hundreds of cases daily, scraping away dead tissue, applying antifungal powder from limited supplies, bandaging wounds that would be soaked again within hours. The worst cases required evacuation, because Marines couldn't patrol on feet covered with open sores. But evacuation wasn't possible for most, so Marines wrapped their feet in whatever cloth they could find, put their boots back on, and kept fighting. The pain was constant, the smell of rotting flesh unforgettable. Decades later, Guadalcanal veterans would cite jungle rot as vividly as combat when asked what they remembered most about the island. Food scarcity compounded all other medical problems. The division had been on 2/3 rations since late August, consuming supplies faster than the Navy could deliver replacements. By October, rations dropped to 2 meals daily, approximately 1,800 calories per man, when manual labor in tropical heat required 4,000. Marines supplemented their diet with captured Japanese rice, which tasted better than American rations, but was nutritionally incomplete. They foraged abandoned gardens for papayas, coconuts, and vegetables. They killed wild pigs and chickens, cooking meat over small fires that risked revealing positions to Japanese observers. Weight loss was universal and severe. The average Marine lost 25 pounds during the Guadalcanal campaign. Photographs taken before and after showed the same men transformed, faces gaunt, eyes hollow, bodies stripped of fat and muscle mass. They looked like concentration camp survivors, not combat troops of the world's richest nation. October 3rd brought a mass funeral for 17 Marines who died of disease in 1 week, more than had died at Tenaro. Chaplain Father Keogh conducted the service near the division cemetery that was filling with crosses far faster than anyone had anticipated. He read the names, spoke words about sacrifice and duty that felt inadequate given the circumstances. These Marines hadn't died heroically in combat. They died in cots, shaking with fever or dehydrated from dysentery, unable to fight the microscopic enemies that had killed them. Their deaths didn't make headlines back home. They didn't earn medals. They contributed to casualty statistics that understated combat effectiveness, because a man evacuated for malaria counted the same as a man killed in action, though the former might return, and the latter never would. The funeral depressed everyone who attended. The Marines could accept combat deaths as the price of fighting. Disease deaths felt like waste, pointless sacrifice to poor planning, and inadequate supply. The psychological toll manifested in ways the Marine Corps had no doctrine for addressing. Corpsmen and medical officers noted increasing cases of what they termed operational fatigue. Marines unable to sleep despite exhaustion, exhibiting tremors, starting violently at sudden noises, unable to focus on tasks. By October, 40% of the division showed symptoms of combat stress to some degree. The constant bombardment, the recurring malaria fevers, the inadequate food, the knowledge that they were trapped on this island with no clear end in sight, all of it accumulated into psychological damage that didn't require direct combat exposure. A Marine who'd fought at Tenero and Edson's Ridge might be fine psychologically, but add 2 months of nightly bombardment, recurring malaria, starvation rations, watching friends die of disease, and that same Marine became a 1,000-yard stair casualty, unable to function. The division had no psychiatric services beyond chaplains, and no procedure for evacuating psychological casualties who hadn't completely broken down. Marines who were struggling stayed in the line because the division needed them, grinding themselves down further with each day. The division's fighting effectiveness eroded in ways difficult to quantify but unmistakable to commanders. Patrols moved more slowly, took longer to complete missions. Units required more time to prepare for operations. Response to Japanese probing attacks became sluggish. Physical conditioning that had been excellent in August deteriorated by October. Marines simply lacked the calories to maintain muscle mass and endurance. Marksmanship suffered because shaking hands from recurring malaria fever couldn't hold a rifle steady. Night vision, critical for defensive operations, degraded from vitamin deficiencies caused by inadequate diet. These degradations were incremental, barely noticeable day to day, but devastating when measured across weeks. The 1st Marine Division that had fought at Edson's Ridge in mid-September was demonstrably more capable than the same unit in late October, even though it had gained combat experience. Disease and starvation were destroying the division more effectively than Japanese attacks. Senior commanders recognized the crisis but had no solutions. Vandegrift repeatedly requested relief, additional supplies, medical evacuation for the worst cases. The Navy promised support, but delivery remained sporadic. Tokyo Express bombardments and air raids made supply runs dangerous, limiting what could be delivered. The division was trapped in a strategic cul-de-sac. They had to hold Henderson Field because losing it meant losing Guadalcanal, but holding it required resources that weren't arriving in sufficient quantities to sustain the force. Guadalcanal had become a siege where the besieged held the objective but couldn't escape, and the besiegers couldn't quite close the noose. Both sides were bleeding out in slow motion, measuring survival in weekly increments, knowing that whoever collapsed first would lose everything. For the Marines of the 1st Division, October 1942 was the darkest period of the campaign. More casualties from disease than combat, no relief in sight, supplies running critically low, enemy forces growing stronger through Tokyo Express deliveries, while they grew weaker through attrition. Victory at Tenaru and Edson's Ridge felt increasingly hollow when measured against the daily reality of wasting away from malaria and starvation. The Marine Corps' institutional response to Guadalcanal's medical crisis would reshape doctrine for the remainder of the Pacific War. Medical officers compiled detailed reports on disease vectors, preventive measures, and treatment protocols. They recommended issuing mosquito netting, insect repellent, water purification tablets, and antimalarial drugs in sufficient quantities. They documented the necessity of proper sanitation facilities even in combat conditions. They proved that combat effectiveness depended as much on logistics and medical support as on training and weapons. These recommendations reached Fleet Marine Force headquarters and became policy for subsequent amphibious operations. The Marines who landed at Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu benefited from lessons learned on Guadalcanal, carrying more medical supplies, better preventive equipment, clearer doctrine for field sanitation. But that was later, after the 1st Division had paid the tuition in blood and disease for the entire Marine Corps. In October 1942, the men on Guadalcanal were still learning those lessons the hard way, dying of malaria and dysentery while waiting for relief that might never come. The island had become their prison and their purgatory, a place where survival was measured in daily increments, and victory meant simply lasting one more day than the enemy. October 23, 1942, 19:30 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Burwell Chesty Puller stood at the command post of 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, studying terrain maps by flashlight and not liking what he saw. His battalion held the western sector of the Marine perimeter, anchored on the Matanikau River, a sluggish jungle stream that formed a natural boundary between American and Japanese forces. Intelligence reported major Japanese troop movements in the hills west of the Matanikau. The 17th Army under Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, 7,000 men including the veteran 2nd Sendai Division. Puller knew what was coming. The Japanese had tried frontal assault at Tenaru, disaster. They tried infiltration at Edson's Ridge, disaster. Now they would try coordinated attack from multiple directions with overwhelming force. Puller's battalion, 3 rifle companies, roughly 900 men weakened by malaria and short rations, would face the main attack. His position was along a ridge the Marines had started calling Coffin Corner for its prominence and obvious tactical value. If the Japanese broke through here, they'd flank the entire western perimeter and reach Henderson Field. Puller intended to die on this ridge before allowing that to happen. The terrain favored the attacker in almost every respect. The Matanikau River formed a natural approach line, with jungle-covered ravines providing concealment right up to the Marine positions. The Japanese held the high ground to the south and west, could observe American positions, could mass forces in dead ground. Puller's battalion occupied a reverse slope position, tactically sound for defense but psychologically nerve-wracking because they couldn't see the enemy until he crested the ridge. Puller had registered the 11th Marines artillery on every approach route, marked range cards for his machine guns, sighted automatic weapons to create interlocking fields of fire. But his front was too wide for available troops. Gaps existed between companies where Japanese infiltrators could slip through. The defense depended on Marines holding their positions, refusing to panic when the line was penetrated, trusting that reserves would counterattack and restore the position. It was doctrinal perfection on paper. In the chaos of night combat, Doctrine had a way of evaporating under pressure. October 24th, 0200 hours. The Japanese assault began with artillery preparation. 75mm mountain guns firing from positions west of the Matanikau. Shells impacted along Puller's line. Airburst shrapnel shredding jungle canopy. High explosive rounds cratering foxholes. The Marines huddled in their positions, enduring the bombardment, waiting for the infantry assault they knew would follow. At 0230 the artillery lifted, and Japanese infantry emerged from the jungle, screaming "Banzai" and firing rifles as they charged. The 29th Infantry Regiment hit Puller's center and left flank in regimental strength, 3,000 men attacking a front held by 600 Marines. The sheer mass of the assault overwhelmed forward positions. Company B's line buckled, then broke as Japanese infantry poured through gaps, getting behind Marine positions, attacking from multiple directions. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted across a half-mile front. Marines and Japanese soldiers grappling in foxholes, using knives and entrenching tools because rifles were useless at arm's length. 05:15 hours brought the crisis point. Company B had been overrun, survivors falling back in disorder. The Japanese breakthrough threatened to collapse the entire battalion position. Puller moved his command post forward against all Doctrine, placing himself at the point of contact to rally the defense. He grabbed disorganized Marines, physically shoved them into firing positions, his voice cutting through chaos. "Hold this position, or we're all dead." On the right flank, Sergeant John Basilone of Company C's machine gun section faced the full weight of the Japanese breakthrough. His gun crews had been killed or wounded. He was alone manning 2 M1917 Browning machine guns, water-jacketed weapons weighing 93 pounds each. Basilone fired both guns alternately, traversing to cover a 200-yard front, changing barrels when they glowed red-hot, burning his hands so severely he wrapped them in cloth torn from his uniform. He killed 38 Japanese soldiers in 4 hours of sustained fire, holding a gap in the line single-handedly while ammunition bearers brought forward more belts. The defense held because Basilone and a dozen Marines like him refused to abandon their positions. Dawn on October 24th revealed the tactical situation, and it was nearly catastrophic. 1st Battalion, 7th Marines had been reduced to 40% strength, with over 500 casualties in 4 hours. Company B had ceased to exist as an organized unit. The Japanese held penetrations deep into the Marine position, occupying ground within yards of the battalion command post. Puller's line had bent almost to breaking, but hadn't snapped. The Japanese had achieved tactical penetration, but not breakthrough. Their assault waves channeled into killing zones, where Marine automatic weapons and artillery inflicted massive casualties. As morning light revealed the battlefield, both sides assessed damage. The Marines had held by the thinnest margin. The Japanese had lost between 2,000 and 3,000 men. Estimates varied, killed in frontal assaults against prepared positions. Neither side could afford another night like that. The Japanese continued attacking through October 25th, launching smaller assaults, attempting to exploit the previous night's penetrations. Each attack failed with severe losses. The 2nd Sendai Division, considered an elite formation with combat experience in China and the Philippines, was being systematically destroyed against Marine defensive positions. The failure wasn't due to Japanese courage or tactical skill. They demonstrated both in abundance. It was arithmetic. American firepower, particularly artillery and machine guns, simply killed attackers faster than they could close with defenders. The Marines were firing 70,000 small arms rounds per night. The 11th Marines fired 6,000 artillery rounds over 2 days. That weight of fire, concentrated on limited frontage, created a killing zone nothing could cross. The Japanese doctrine of aggressive spirit overcoming material inferiority was being disproven with every attack, but Imperial headquarters wasn't ready to accept that lesson. Sergeant Basilone's action at Coffin Corner became legendary within hours. Word spread through the division of the machine gunner who'd held a 200-yard gap alone, who'd fired 15,000 rounds in one night, who'd killed dozens of enemy soldiers through sheer determination and weapon proficiency. Puller put Basilone in for the Medal of Honor immediately, recognizing that individual heroism of that magnitude deserved recognition. The award would be approved in early 1943, making Basilone one of the Pacific War's first Marine heroes. But the attention embarrassed Basilone. He'd done what any Marine would do in that situation, his job. The Marines who survived Coffin Corner understood that Basilone's action wasn't anomalous heroism, it was trained reflex under pressure. He'd done what boot camp and weapons training had prepared him to do, engage targets efficiently until the enemy withdrew or he died. The Marines cultivated that mindset deliberately. You were a member of a machine gun section. Your job was to deliver sustained fire on target. You did that job regardless of casualties or circumstances. Basilone embodied that ethos perfectly. The cost of holding Kampfgruppe Corner forced Vandergrift to confront an unpleasant truth. The 1st Division was approaching combat ineffectiveness. 1st Battalion, 7th Marines required complete reconstitution. The unit was combat ineffective until it received replacements and reorganization. Other battalions were in similar condition. The cumulative casualties from Tanaru, Edson's Ridge, and now Coffin Corner, combined with disease attrition, had reduced the division to perhaps 7,000 effective combatants. The Japanese, despite heavier casualties, could replace losses through Tokyo Express runs. The Marines couldn't. Reinforcements from the United States required weeks of transit, and the Navy wasn't guaranteeing safe passage. Vandergrift requested immediate relief, emergency reinforcement, anything to sustain the division. Washington's response was cautious. Reinforcements were en route but wouldn't arrive for weeks. The 1st Division would have to hold Guadalcanal with what they had. It was an order that ignored tactical reality, but operational necessity left no choice. Guadalcanal couldn't be abandoned, and the 1st Division was the only force available to hold it. The Japanese High Command drew exactly the wrong conclusion from Coffin Corner. They analyzed the battle and determined that failure was due to insufficient force application rather than flawed tactical doctrine. The solution was obvious: commit more troops, achieve greater numerical superiority, overwhelm the Americans through sheer mass. This logic drove Japanese reinforcement through November, feeding division strength formations into Guadalcanal piecemeal, losing thousands of men in attacks that gained no ground. The Americans, facing this onslaught, also drew conclusions that shaped subsequent doctrine. Defensive positions worked when properly prepared and defended by troops who wouldn't abandon them under pressure. Artillery integration was decisive. Nothing broke infantry assaults like pre-registered defensive fires. Machine guns employed in depth created interlocking bands of fire that no assault could cross. These tactical principles, validated at Coffin Corner, became Fleet Marine Force doctrine for the remainder of the war. Every Marine who fought on Peleliu, Iwo Jima, or Okinawa benefited from lessons learned by Chesty Puller's battalion in October 1942. The Marines who survived Kampf Corner gained a particular status in the division's hierarchy. They'd faced the strongest Japanese ground offensive of the campaign and held their positions under conditions that should have resulted in defeat. The battalion received a Presidential Unit Citation, recognizing exceptional performance in combat. Individual Marines received Silver Stars, Bronze Stars, and commendations. But the recognition felt hollow to men who'd lost friends, who'd watched Marines die in foxholes, who'd participated in slaughter on a scale that made Tenero look small. Victory didn't erase memory. It didn't restore the dead to life. It didn't change the fact that they were still on Guadalcanal, still starving and sick, still facing an enemy that wouldn't quit, still waiting for relief that might never come. Kampf Corner was a tactical victory that felt like strategic stalemate. The Marines had proven they could defend Henderson Field against any Japanese attack. The question nobody could answer was how much longer they could keep doing it before the division collapsed from accumulated strain. October 1942 ended with that question unresolved, hanging over the 1st Marine Division like the tropical rain that fell nightly, soaking everything, making sleep impossible, reminding them that Guadalcanal was still their prison and might yet become their grave. December 9, 1942. 5th Marines boarded USS President Jackson at Lunga Point, moving in slow shuffles up gangplanks, Marines so exhausted they could barely climb the steep incline. Sailors topside watched the boarding with shock visible on their faces. These weren't the Marines they'd seen in recruiting posters or newsreels. These were walking skeletons, emaciated men with hollow eyes, skin stretched over prominent bones, uniforms hanging loose on frames that had lost 35 pounds since August. Every Marine was sick. 75% had malaria. Many could barely walk unassisted. Their weapons were corroded from months in tropical humidity. Their boots had disintegrated. Some men boarded ship wrapped in cloth torn from shelter halves. They moved without speaking, without looking at each other, automatons going through mechanical motions of evacuation. The sailors didn't know what to say. Neither did the Marines. They'd survived Guadalcanal, but the cost of survival was visible in every gaunt face, every labored movement, every 1,000-yard stare. The relief of the 1st Marine Division was medical evacuation, disguised as routine troop rotation. Vandegrift had requested relief in October, arguing that his division was approaching total breakdown. Higher command agreed reluctantly. The Army's 25th Infantry Division and 2nd Marine Division would assume responsibility for Guadalcanal, while the 1st Division evacuated to Australia for reconstitution. But it wasn't a victory parade. The Marines who boarded ships in early December were shattered men, physically and psychologically damaged by 127 days of combat operations against an enemy that wouldn't quit and disease that had no cure. Medical officers conducting embarkation physicals were appalled at the division's condition. One reported 74% of evacuees have active malaria requiring immediate treatment. 25% have dysentery. 40% show signs of malnutrition-related disorders. 15% exhibit severe combat fatigue, requiring psychiatric evaluation. The 1st Marine Division wasn't rotating out of combat. It was being pulled off the line before it disintegrated completely. December 10th brought a moment that captured the campaign's cost. Army soldiers of the 25th Infantry Division came ashore to relieve Marine positions. They were fresh troops, healthy, well-fed, carrying new equipment and full combat loads. They spread out to occupy defensive positions the Marines had held for 4 months, digging into foxholes that still smelled of cordite and blood, finding brass casings by the thousands, and unburied Japanese bodies in the wire. The contrast between arriving Army soldiers and departing Marines was stark beyond belief. A 25th Division lieutenant later recalled, "We thought we were in good shape until we saw the Marines leaving. They looked like concentration camp survivors. I wondered what kind of hell we were walking into that could do that to Marines." The Marines passed the Army soldiers without comment, too exhausted for the usual inter-service rivalry. They'd done their job. Now it was the Army's problem. Most Marines felt only relief, tinged with guilt, at abandoning Guadalcanal before the Japanese were defeated. Aboard the transports, the 1st Division began the transition from combat unit to medical evacuation. Navy corpsmen set up treatment stations in holds, administering quinine and atabrine to lines of fever-ridden Marines. They treated jungle rot, debriding infected tissue, wrapping wounds that would take months to heal. They monitored dysentery cases, providing rehydration salts and antibiotics when available. The seriously ill were segregated, placed under constant observation. 7 Marines died during the transit to Australia. Death from malaria complications, from dysentery-induced dehydration, from bodies too damaged to recover, even when removed from combat. Those deaths aboard ship, after evacuation to safety, felt particularly cruel. The Marines had survived combat only to die from disease once the shooting stopped. Each burial at sea was attended by whoever could stand, Marines in various states of illness watching another comrade committed to the Pacific, wondering if they'd be next. The division's statistical record told the story that individual experiences couldn't fully capture. 774 Marines killed in action, 1,962 wounded in action, 8,580 evacuated for disease. Total casualties 11,316 out of 19,514 who'd landed in August. 58% casualty rate over 127 days, an average of 89 casualties per day, every single day for more than 4 months. For comparison, the bloodiest single-day battle in American history, Antietam, inflicted 23,000 casualties in 12 hours. Guadalcanal inflicted half that many over 4 months of grinding attrition. The difference was time. Antietam was horrific, but brief. Guadalcanal was moderate-intensity horror, sustained endlessly, wearing down men through accumulated strain, rather than single catastrophic trauma. The campaign's strategic outcome was clear by December, even though fighting would continue through February. The Japanese had committed 36,000 troops to Guadalcanal. They evacuated 13,000 survivors in February 1943, abandoning 23,000 dead to disease, starvation, and combat. The 1st Marine Division had achieved its mission, seize and hold Henderson Field, denying the Japanese an airbase that would have interdicted Allied supply lines to Australia. That strategic victory came at cost that raised questions about operational sustainability. Could the Marine Corps afford to destroy its premier division every campaign? The Corps numbered only 120,000 Marines in late 1942. The 1st Division represented 15% of that strength and had been rendered combat ineffective for 9 months. The mathematics of attrition suggested the Corps couldn't sustain this level of casualties across multiple operations. Something would have to change. Tactics, doctrine, medical support, or strategic objectives, or the Marine Corps would bleed itself out before the war's midpoint. December 22, 1942, the transports carrying 1st Division entered Melbourne Harbour, and the Marines saw their first friendly civilization since leaving New Zealand in July. The Australian government had requested that American forces stage through Australia, and Melbourne had become the primary port for Pacific theater operations. Australians crowded the docks to greet the arriving Americans, waving flags, holding welcome signs, cheering. Then they saw the Marines disembark. The cheering faltered, women covered their mouths, horrified. Children stared in confusion at the skeletal soldiers who shuffled down gangplanks moving like elderly men. The Red Cross had established emergency feeding stations on the docks, providing hot meals to Marines who'd been on starvation rations for months. Some Marines couldn't eat regular food. Their digestive systems had adjusted to subsistence diet and rejected normal portions. Medics warned them to eat slowly, small amounts, letting their bodies readjust gradually. But the food was there, hot meals in unlimited quantity, and Marines gorged themselves, vomiting from overeating, then eating more. The feeding stations became triage centers, as corpsmen dealt with Marines whose desperation to eat after months of hunger made them sick. The Australian public's reaction to the 1st Division's conditions sparked outrage that reached American newspapers. Photos of Marines being helped off ships too weak to walk unassisted appeared in stateside publications. The Roosevelt administration faced uncomfortable questions. Why were Marines starving on Guadalcanal? Why weren't they receiving adequate supplies? Why was disease claiming more casualties than combat? The Navy and Marine Corps responded with investigations, after-action reports, and promises to improve logistics for future operations. But those promises came too late for the 1st Division. The damage was done, written into the division's casualty lists and the medical records of thousands of Marines who'd aged decades in 4 months. Guadalcanal veterans would carry physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Many developed chronic malaria, with recurring fever episodes years after the campaign. Others struggled with what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder, unable to speak about their experiences, unable to forget them. Melbourne became the 1st Division's refuge and recovery location for the next 7 months. The Marines dispersed to camps around Victoria, spending weeks in medical treatment before beginning reconstitution. The division required 8,000 replacements to reach authorized strength. Those replacements arrived from boot camp and advanced infantry training. Young Marines who'd heard stories about Guadalcanal but hadn't experienced it. They met veterans who'd been there, men not much older than themselves but fundamentally different. The veterans had a look, hard-eyed, quiet, contemptuous of anything that hadn't been tested in combat. They'd earned the right to that attitude. They'd survived the worst campaign in Marine Corps history to that point. They'd proven themselves against an enemy that accepted no quarter and gave none. They'd held ground that Washington had written off, that higher command had abandoned, that everyone except the men doing the fighting thought was lost. They'd saved Australia from Japanese invasion, though few Australians understood how close that had been. They were the old breed now, the original 1st Division, and nothing would ever be the same. The division's Guadalcanal veterans faced a strange form of survivor's guilt. They'd made it off the island. Nearly 1,000 of their comrades hadn't. Why had they survived when better Marines died? There was no rational answer, just luck and probability and the randomness of artillery shells and machine gun fire. Some veterans couldn't shake the feeling that they'd abandoned Guadalcanal, that leaving the island meant leaving their dead behind. Others felt relief tinged with shame, relief at surviving, shame at feeling relief, when so many hadn't. The Marine Corps provided no psychological support for these complicated emotions. Marines were expected to be tough, to process trauma internally, to move on to the next fight. Most did exactly that, burying their feelings and getting on with the war. But the cost of that emotional suppression would surface decades later in broken marriages, substance abuse, nightmares that never fully stopped. Guadalcanal had forged the 1st Marine Division into an elite combat force. It had also damaged everyone who'd been there in ways that wouldn't become apparent until the war ended and the veterans tried to return to civilian life. The relief of the 1st Marine Division marked the end of the campaign's first phase and the beginning of its legend. The Marines had landed on August 7th expecting a quick raid and found themselves trapped in a 4-month siege. They'd survived through combination of tactical skill, individual courage, supporting arms, and sheer bloody-minded refusal to quit. They'd proven that American forces could defeat Japanese infantry in sustained combat, shattering the myth of Japanese invincibility that had persisted since Pearl Harbor. They'd held Henderson Field despite every Japanese effort to destroy it, maintaining the airbase that would eventually win the campaign. They'd done all this while starving, sick, isolated, and convinced they'd been abandoned by higher command. And then they'd evacuated to Australia to die quietly of malaria or spend months recovering enough to fight again. There were no parades for the Guadalcanal veterans, no ticker tape welcomes. They'd done their job in obscurity and would heal in obscurity while the war moved on to other islands, other battles, other Marines who would learn the same lessons the 1st Division had paid for in blood. Guadalcanal was over for the 1st Marine Division. The cost of victory was written in casualty lists, medical records, and the haunted eyes of 10,000 survivors who knew what war really meant. And somewhere in Washington and Melbourne, staff officers were already planning the division's next operation, because the Pacific War had 3 more years to run, and the Marines who'd proven themselves at Guadalcanal would be needed again. January 15, 1943, Camp Cable outside Melbourne, Australia. Sergeant Mitchell Page stood before a formation of replacement Marines fresh from the United States, their uniforms still crisp, their faces still soft with youth. He'd been tasked with teaching them what they needed to know about jungle combat, about the Japanese, about survival. Page had earned the Medal of Honor at Guadalcanal for manning a machine gun position alone after his entire section was killed, holding the line through a night of attacks that should have killed him. Now he was an instructor, translating 4 months of combat experience into lessons that might keep these new Marines alive. He looked at their eager faces and felt a gulf wider than the Pacific Ocean. They thought they knew what war was. They'd completed boot camp, qualified with their rifles, learned small unit tactics. They had no idea. Page couldn't explain Guadalcanal to them any more than he could explain color to a blind man. But he would try, because these replacements were the new 1st Division, and somebody had to teach them before they got their own lessons written in blood. The reconstitution of the 1st Marine Division represented the largest rebuilding effort in Marine Corps history. The division that evacuated Guadalcanal numbered approximately 7,000 effectives out of an authorized strength of 19,000. 8,000 replacements arrived between January and April 1943, fresh Marines from Parris Island and San Diego, most with less than 6 months of service. They represented 60% of the division's final strength. This created a fundamental tension. The division's institutional identity was built on Guadalcanal experience, but most Marines hadn't been there. The veterans, the 40% who'd survived the canal, became the division's core, the living repository of combat knowledge. They filled sergeant and corporal billets, squad leader and fire team leader positions. They became the connective tissue that would hold the rebuilt division together when it returned to combat. But integrating 8,000 replacements with 7,000 traumatized veterans required careful management and months of intensive training. The training regime at Camp Cable reflected hard lessons purchased at Guadalcanal. Night combat drills became mandatory. Every Marine practiced moving silently in darkness, navigating by compass without lights, maintaining unit cohesion without verbal communication. They rehearsed immediate action drills for ambushes and surprise contact. They practiced defensive positions in depth, learning how Guadalcanal veterans had created interlocking fields of fire that stopped Japanese banzai charges. Physical conditioning intensified beyond boot camp standards. The Marines needed endurance to patrol in tropical heat, carrying 60-pound combat loads. Live fire exercises pushed realism to dangerous levels. Marines maneuvered under actual machine gun fire, learning to recognize the sound of rounds passing overhead versus rounds directed at them. Training accidents occurred with predictable frequency. 2 Marines died in live fire accidents in March alone. But the alternative, sending unprepared Marines into combat, would cost far more lives. Equipment upgrades transformed the division into a fundamentally more capable force. The M1 Garand rifle replaced the last Springfield bolt actions, giving every Marine 8 rounds of semi-automatic fire versus 5 rounds of bolt action. The difference was substantial in close combat, where rate of fire often determined survival. The SCR-300 walkie-talkie replaced unreliable older radios, providing squad leaders with direct communication to company command posts. This solved one of Guadalcanal's critical failures. Isolated units had lost contact during Japanese attacks, creating gaps that nearly broke the defensive line. The new radios were heavier and more complex, but they worked reliably in tropical conditions. Most significantly, the division received 120 LVT-1 amphibious tractors, the alligators, that could cross coral reefs under their own power. Guadalcanal's landing had succeeded partly through Japanese incompetence. Future operations would face defended beaches where crossing reefs in vulnerable wooden boats meant slaughter. The alligators gave Marines protected mobility from ship to shore. April 1943 brought the division's most important equipment upgrade, a full tank battalion. Company A, 1st Tank Battalion, had fought on Guadalcanal with 5 M2A4 light tanks, mounting 37mm guns, adequate for supporting infantry, but ineffective against fortifications. The new tank battalion fielded 46 M4 Sherman medium tanks with 75mm main guns, capable of destroying Japanese bunkers and pillboxes. The Shermans weighed 30 tons, mounted 2-inch thick frontal armor, and could withstand Japanese anti-tank weapons. More importantly, the division's infantry trained with the tanks, learning combined arms tactics that had been improvised on Guadalcanal. Tank infantry teams practiced coordinated assault on fortified positions, tanks suppressing bunkers with main gunfire, while infantry maneuvered to flanks, infantry marking targets for tanks with smoke grenades, both elements communicating via radio and hand signals. This combined arms integration would prove decisive in future operations, where Japanese defenders occupied prepared positions that infantry alone couldn't reduce. The Atherton Tableland training area in Queensland provided terrain similar to what the division would face in future operations. Dense rainforest, steep ridges, limited roads, humidity and heat that matched the Solomon Islands. The division conducted full-scale amphibious exercises, loading combat equipment aboard ships in the correct combat sequence. The Wellington disaster would not be repeated. They practiced beach assaults, each regiment conducting multiple landings until boat crews and infantry could coordinate effectively. They rehearsed emergency procedures for when plans collapsed, communication failures, landing in wrong sectors, encountering unexpected defenses. The emphasis was realistic training, under conditions that approximated combat stress. Veterans from Guadalcanal observed that training at Atherton was harder than actual combat in some respects. At least the Japanese gave you breaks between attacks. The training at Atherton was relentless, designed to make combat seem almost easy by comparison. May 1943 marked a crucial organizational change. Colonel Louis Chesty Puller received command of 7th Marines, replacing the previous regimental commander who'd been relieved for medical reasons. Puller's promotion brought Guadalcanal's most aggressive combat leader to regimental command, where his tactical philosophy would shape an entire regiment. Puller believed in leading from the front, in aggressive patrolling, in maintaining pressure on the enemy regardless of casualties. His Marines would attack when other commanders consolidated. They would patrol when others stayed in defensive positions. They would accept casualties to gain tactical advantage. This aggressive mindset had worked at Coffin Corner, where Puller's refusal to yield ground had stopped the Japanese breakthrough. It would work again at Cape Gloucester and Peleliu, though at costs that raised questions about whether aggressiveness should be moderated by tactical judgment. But in May 1943, Puller represented everything the Marine Corps valued: courage, tactical skill, and absolute commitment to mission accomplishment, regardless of personal risk. The integration of replacements with Guadalcanal veterans created two distinct cultures within the division. The veterans called themselves the Old Breed, a term borrowed from Confederate Army rhetoric, and treated replacements with mixture of contempt and protective mentorship. They hazed new Marines mercilessly, forcing them to prove themselves in training before accepting them. They told stories about Guadalcanal that grew more horrific with each retelling, partly to educate, partly to establish dominance in the division's social hierarchy. The replacements, for their part, recognized that survival depended on learning from veterans. They absorbed lessons about Japanese tactics, about jungle warfare, about the importance of following orders and trusting the Marines on your flanks. Slowly, through shared training and mutual dependence, the two groups merged into a cohesive unit. By June 1943, a replacement Marine who trained under Guadalcanal veterans for 5 months had absorbed much of the division's institutional knowledge, even if he hadn't personally experienced combat. The Australian public embraced the 1st Division with enthusiasm that bordered on adoption. Melbournians opened their homes to Marines, invited them to dinners, introduced them to daughters despite parental misgivings about American servicemen's intentions. The Marines, for their part, were grateful for civilian kindness after months of isolation on Guadalcanal. Romances blossomed. Australian women found American Marines exotic. They spoke differently, carried themselves with confidence the British didn't have, and possessed money from higher military pay. The Marines found Australian women refreshingly direct compared to American girls, willing to date without elaborate courtship rituals. These relationships caused friction with Australian servicemen, who resented Americans stealing their women. Bar fights between Marines and Australian soldiers became common enough that military police established joint patrols in Melbourne. The worst incident, the Battle of Brisbane in November 1942, involved elements of other American units, but established the pattern. Americans and Australians were allies in strategic terms, but rivals for resources and female attention. The division's medical reconstitution took far longer than equipment replacement or tactical training. Marines who'd contracted malaria on Guadalcanal discovered that recovery didn't mean cure. Plasmodium parasites remained dormant in liver cells, causing recurring fever episodes months or years after initial infection. A Marine who'd been cleared for duty might suffer sudden relapse, spiking fever, chills, delirium, requiring hospitalization, and weeks of treatment. The division maintained a constant sick call of 500 to 800 Marines suffering malaria relapses through mid-1943. Psychiatric casualties proved even more difficult to manage. The Marine Corps had no doctrine for combat fatigue, no procedures for identifying Marines who'd been psychologically damaged by Guadalcanal. Some veterans exhibited obvious symptoms: violent nightmares, inability to sleep, explosive anger at minor provocations, and were quietly discharged as medically unfit. Others functioned adequately in garrison, but would break down under combat stress, their Guadalcanal trauma unresolved. The division carried these damaged men forward because it needed experienced personnel, gambling that they'd hold together in combat. Some did. Others became casualties not from enemy action, but from psychological collapse, dragged off firing lines by corpsmen while they screamed about Japanese soldiers only they could see. By July 1943, the 1st Marine Division had completed its transformation from shattered Guadalcanal survivors to reconstituted combat force. Division strength reached 19,500 Marines, fully equipped, trained to unprecedented standards, led by officers and senior NCOs who'd proven themselves in sustained combat. The division had absorbed Guadalcanal's lessons and codified them as doctrine. They knew how to fight Japanese infantry in jungle terrain. They knew how to integrate supporting arms, artillery, tanks, air support into infantry operations. They knew how to defend key terrain against numerically superior forces. They knew the cost of combat and were prepared to pay it. What they didn't know was where they'd fight next. Rumors circulated constantly. Back to the Solomons, New Guinea, Central Pacific atolls, the division prepared for every possibility, training in amphibious operations, jungle warfare, and urban combat. They would go where they were ordered, do what they were told, and win or die trying. That was the essence of the old breed mentality that Guadalcanal had forged and Australia had preserved. They were the 1st Marine Division, proven in combat, rebuilt through institutional knowledge, ready to fight again. And somewhere in Pacific Theater headquarters, staff officers were selecting their next target. December 26, 1943, 0630 hours. The ramp of Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Walt's LVT-1 Alligator dropped onto the beach at Cape Gloucester, New Britain, and Marines splashed into ankle-deep water under a sky that unleashed rain in sheets. This wasn't the light tropical rain of Guadalcanal. This was monsoon, water falling so heavily that visibility dropped to 10 yards, turning the beach into a confusion of shadows and shapes. Walt led 2nd Battalion 5th Marines inland. Compass navigation because visual landmarks didn't exist in the whiteout conditions. The landing was unopposed. The Japanese had withdrawn inland, but the rain proved a more effective enemy than any defensive fire could have been. Marines stumbled through coconut groves where water cascaded from fronds, soaking through uniforms in seconds, filling boots, making weapons slippery. Within an hour of landing, every Marine was drenched, every piece of equipment dripping, and the temperature felt like 85 degrees with 95% humidity. They'd landed in a tropical rainforest during monsoon season. Cape Gloucester would be an environmental nightmare before the Japanese fired a shot. The strategic objective was clear. Even if the weather wasn't, Cape Gloucester's airfield would neutralize the massive Japanese naval base at Rabaul, 135 miles to the east. Rabaul was the strongest Japanese position in the Southwest Pacific, with 4 airfields, a deep-water harbor and garrison of over 100,000 troops. Direct assault on Rabaul would be suicidal. MacArthur's strategy was encirclement, seize surrounding islands, build airfields, isolate Rabaul through air interdiction. Cape Gloucester fit this strategy perfectly. Its airfield would put American fighters and bombers within range of Rabaul's supply lines. Japanese convoys couldn't sustain the base if aircraft from Cape Gloucester attacked every ship approaching. The 1st Marine Division's mission was simple: seize the airfield, hold it long enough for Seabees to make it operational. Let the Air Force do the rest. It sounded straightforward in briefings. The reality would prove considerably more complex. December 27th, 7th Marines advanced through jungle, where the word jungle failed to capture the reality. This was rainforest, triple canopy vegetation so dense that ground-level visibility measured 10 to 15 yards. Navigation was by compass and dead reckoning. Maps showed contours and rivers, but couldn't depict the wall of vegetation that blocked every path. Marines hacked through undergrowth with machetes, gaining perhaps a mile per day, exhausted by the effort of moving through vegetation that seemed designed to stop human passage. The rain never stopped. It fell constantly, sometimes as light drizzle, sometimes as torrential downpour, always enough to keep everything wet. Weapons corroded despite constant cleaning. Ammunition got wet, primers failed. Radio batteries died from moisture infiltration. Feet softened in wet boots, developing jungle rot within 48 hours. The division had landed prepared for combat. They'd fought an environment instead. December 30th brought the first significant Japanese resistance. 1st Battalion, 7th Marines assaulted Hill 6, 60 jungle-covered ridge overlooking the approaches to Cape Gloucester airfield. The Japanese had fortified the ridge with interconnected bunkers, each position mutually supporting. The entire complex nearly invisible until Marines were within grenade range. The assault degenerated into a crawl through mud. Marines advancing yards at a time, suppressing bunkers with rifle fire, while other teams maneuvered to flanks. The rain turned the hillside into a mudslide. Marines climbed hand over hand, grabbing vegetation for purchase, slipping backward when roots gave way. Japanese defenders fired from bunkers that were essentially caves dug into the hillside, immune to small arms fire. Reducing each position required flamethrowers or demolitions. Marines crawling forward with satchel charges while riflemen provided covering fire. The battle for Hill 660 took 6 hours to advance 200 yards. By evening, 1st Battalion had taken the objective with 43 casualties. They counted 78 Japanese dead in the bunker complex, every defender killed in place, no prisoners. January 2, 1944 revealed the Sherman's limitations in tropical terrain. 1st Tank Battalion attempted to support infantry advancing along the coastal track toward Cape Gloucester town. The tank's 30-ton vehicles designed for European roads sank to their hulls in mud. Drivers tried to reverse, succeeded only in digging deeper. Infantry engineers arrived with winches, tried to pull the tanks free, broke winch cables. The solution was corduroy roads, felling coconut logs, laying them perpendicular to the direction of travel, creating a semi-solid surface. Building 100 yards of corduroy road required 1 day of labor by an entire engineer company. The tanks advanced at perhaps a mile per day, when roads were available, not at all when they weren't. This wasn't the tank warfare anyone had trained for. This was pioneer work, lumberjacking and road construction, with occasional bursts of combat when Japanese defenders contested the advance. The Marines learned that mechanized warfare in the Pacific required engineers as much as tankers. January 16th brought the assault on Suicide Creek, a stream that flowed through a ravine 50 yards wide where Japanese defenders occupied bunkers on the reverse slope. The position was nearly perfect defensively. Marines had to cross the creek under fire, climb the far bank, then assault bunkers they couldn't see until they were directly on top of them. 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines made 3 attempts, each time driven back by interlocking fire from bunkers that suppressed any Marine who reached the far bank. The breakthrough came through innovation rather than courage. Marines brought flamethrower teams forward, wading chest-deep through the creek, spraying liquid fire across the far bank. The flamethrowers couldn't destroy the bunkers. Concrete and coral were fireproof, but they forced defenders to button up, giving riflemen time to cross and assault with grenades and satchel charges. The creek was secured by evening with 108 Marine casualties and an estimated 200 Japanese dead. The cost was acceptable by Guadalcanal standards. By Cape Gloucester standards, it felt wasteful. The airfield fell on January 8th after methodical reduction of Japanese positions over 2 weeks. The Marines had advanced 6 miles through monsoon and jungle, reducing fortified positions, building roads, evacuating wounded, all while maintaining supply lines back to the beach. Casualties were modest by Pacific War standards. 310 killed, 1,083 wounded over 48 days. This was 1/3 the casualty rate of Guadalcanal, evidence of improved tactics, better equipment, and most significantly, better supply. The Navy maintained logistical support throughout the operation despite monsoon conditions. Marines didn't starve at Cape Gloucester. They didn't run out of ammunition. Medical evacuation was available for serious casualties. The lessons from Guadalcanal had been absorbed at institutional level. The Marine Corps could now project combat power in tropical environments and sustain it through effective logistics. This capability would prove essential in the battles ahead. The amphibious assault at Cape Gloucester validated equipment and doctrine developed during reconstitution. The LVT-1 alligators crossed reefs without difficulty, delivering Marines directly to beaches with minimal confusion. Landing craft crews coordinated with infantry commanders, adjusting landing sequences based on beach conditions rather than following rigid plans. The division unloaded supplies in correct combat sequence, ammunition and water first, administrative supplies last. This was Wellington corrected. The chaotic 1942 landing now replaced by professional execution. Only 7% of landing craft reached wrong beaches versus 40% at Guadalcanal. Communication between ships and shore remained reliable throughout. The Marines had learned how to conduct amphibious operations properly. These skills would be critical at Peleliu, where opposed landings would test every aspect of amphibious doctrine. The monsoon proved more dangerous than Japanese defenders in some respects. Cape Gloucester received 183 inches of rain annually, concentrated in monsoon season from December through February. Marines lived in water, standing in waterlogged foxholes, patrolling through flooded jungle, sleeping in shelter halves that offered psychological comfort but zero protection from rain that penetrated everything. Trenchfoot casualties reached 8% of division strength monthly. Fungal infections were universal. Malaria returned despite prophylactic atabarine. Mosquitoes bred in every water-filled depression, of which the monsoon created millions. The division evacuated disease casualties, at rates approaching Guadalcanal levels. But there was one critical difference. Evacuated Marines were replaced. The 1st Division at Cape Gloucester maintained strength through a constant flow of replacements from rear areas. This was the logistical capability that had been absent on Guadalcanal, the ability to replace casualties and maintain combat effectiveness indefinitely. The Marines could sustain operations as long as supplies and replacements arrived. That sustainability made the division a strategic asset, rather than a wasting resource. The Japanese defense at Cape Gloucester differed fundamentally from Guadalcanal. The garrison numbered approximately 10,000 men under Major General Iwao Matsuda, but they were dispersed across western New Britain rather than concentrated at the airfield. Matsuda had learned from Guadalcanal's failure. He wouldn't mass forces for American firepower to destroy. Instead, he traded space for time, withdrawing inland, forcing Marines to advance through jungle where superior American firepower was negated by terrain. The strategy succeeded partially. The Marines secured the airfield but couldn't destroy the Japanese garrison. Matsuda's forces remained active in New Britain's interior for the remainder of the war, tying down Marine units in garrison duty. This defensive doctrine, withdraw rather than fight decisive battles, preserve force for lengthy resistance, would become standard Japanese practice. It meant that American tactical victories wouldn't translate into strategic resolution. The Japanese couldn't win, but they could make winning prohibitively expensive. Cape Gloucester demonstrated the 1st Division's evolution from Guadalcanal survivors to professional combat force. The same Marines who'd starved and died of disease on Guadalcanal now executed complex operations with precision. They integrated supporting arms, artillery, tanks, air support into infantry operations seamlessly. They maintained supply discipline, ensuring that critical items like ammunition and medical supplies were always available. They evacuated wounded efficiently, coordinating with Navy medical ships for serious cases. They adapted tactics to terrain and enemy, avoiding frontal assaults when flanking maneuvers were possible, using firepower to reduce Japanese positions rather than sacrificing Marines in banzai charges. This tactical maturity was purchased at Guadalcanal and refined through 8 months of training. Cape Gloucester was proof that the Marine Corps could learn from experience and improve. The division that secured Cape Gloucester was fundamentally more capable than the division that had landed on Guadalcanal 16 months earlier. February 19, 1944. The 1st Marine Division completed relief in place with Army forces and departed Cape Gloucester for Pavuvu Island in the Russell Islands. The operation was officially a success. Airfield secured, Japanese garrison neutralized as offensive threat, minimal casualties compared to Guadalcanal. But the Marines leaving New Britain were exhausted again, sick again, ready for rest and reconstitution. They'd been in combat or combat-adjacent operations for 48 days straight, most of it spent in monsoon conditions that destroyed morale as effectively as combat destroyed bodies. They'd proven themselves again, demonstrated that Guadalcanal wasn't a fluke, shown that the 1st Marine Division could fight anywhere the Corps needed them. And now they were being sent to Pavuvu, a supposedly rear area base where they'd rest and refit. What they found on Pavuvu would test the division more severely than Cape Gloucester had. The Japanese could only kill you. Bad logistics and administrative incompetence could make you wish you were dead. The Marines were about to learn that distinction firsthand. April 8, 1944. The first elements of the 1st Marine Division steamed into Pavuvu's harbor, such as it was, and stared at their new home with growing horror. Pavuvu Island measured 4 miles long by 2 miles wide, a former coconut plantation in the Russell Islands, approximately 60 miles northwest of Guadalcanal. The island had been described in planning documents as rear area rest facility for combat units. What the Marines saw was an abandoned plantation, reverting to jungle, covered in rotting coconuts, infested with land crabs the size of dinner plates, and featuring exactly zero infrastructure, no docks, no buildings, no roads, no water system, no electricity, no recreation facilities. The division was being sent to rest on an island that would require weeks of labor just to make minimally habitable. A staff sergeant from 5th Marines surveyed the beach and said what everyone was thinking, we're trading one shithole for another shithole, except this one doesn't even have Japanese to shoot at. The Pavuvu assignment represented systemic failure at high command level. The island had been selected as a staging area without anyone physically inspecting it. Staff officers in rear headquarters reviewed maps, noted Pavuvu's location near supply routes, determined it had sufficient space for a Marine division, and issued orders. What maps couldn't show was that Pavuvu was essentially uninhabitable. The coconut plantation had been abandoned years earlier, leaving millions of rotting coconuts that bred rats and flies in biblical proportions. The coral soil drained poorly, creating swamps during rain and dust clouds during dry periods. The island's freshwater resources consisted of one brackish stream. Previous occupants, a Navy Seabee battalion, had departed after determining the island was unsuitable for habitation. The Marines were sent there anyway, because someone in logistics had decided Pavuvu would work, and changing plans would require admitting error. The 1st Division would spend 5 months on Pavuvu, and those months would damage morale more than any Japanese attack. The rat problem achieved legendary status within days. Coconut rats, large, aggressive rodents, had multiplied to plague proportions feeding on rotting coconuts. Marines estimated 2,000 rats per acre, which wasn't hyperbole. The rats were everywhere, in tents, in supply dumps, in galleys, in bedrolls. They chewed through mosquito netting, ate soap, gnawed on leather boots, even attacked sleeping Marines. The division launched a war against the rats more aggressive than operations against the Japanese. Marines hunted rats with rifles, pistols, clubs, and eventually organized hunting parties that killed hundreds nightly. The Seabees bulldozed the rotting coconuts into piles and burned them, creating pyres that smoldered for days. But the rats adapted faster than the Marines could exterminate them. Poisoning didn't work. Rats avoided the bait. Trapping worked too slowly. The rats remained a constant presence, disgusting, demoralizing, and emblematic of everything wrong with Pavuvu. Supply failures compounded environmental problems. Pavuvu had no dock facilities, which meant supplies arrived aboard ships that anchored offshore and transferred cargo to landing craft. The process was slow, weather-dependent, and inefficient. Critical supplies arrived months late, while unnecessary items appeared immediately. The division received 5,000 brooms for an island with no buildings to sweep before receiving basic construction materials. Replacement equipment for vehicles wore out at Cape Gloucester arrived in July, 4 months after it was needed. Ice plants for preserving food never materialized, which meant Marines ate warm rations in tropical heat. Refrigeration equipment sat in warehouses in Australia, while Marines on Pavuvu ate semi-rotted food. The supply system was functioning, cargo ships were arriving regularly, but nobody was prioritizing what the division actually needed. Bureaucratic inertia ensured that requisitions filed months earlier were being filled regardless of current needs. The absence of recreation facilities devastated morale. Marines coming off combat operations needed physical rest, certainly, but also psychological decompression. They needed movies, sports equipment, libraries, anything to occupy their minds beyond replaying Cape Gloucester in their heads. Pavuvu had none of these things. The Marines built their own recreation facilities from scavenged materials, a volleyball court leveled by hand, a makeshift boxing ring, an outdoor theater using a bedsheet as a screen. These improvised facilities helped but couldn't substitute for proper rest areas. Comparison to the Army's arrangements infuriated the Marines. The 27th Infantry Division was simultaneously resting at Schofield Barracks, Hawaii, with full base facilities, regular liberty in Honolulu, access to beaches and recreation. The 1st Marine Division, with combat record equivalent or superior to any Army unit, was rotting on a rat-infested coconut plantation. The inequity fed into the Marines' perpetual sense of being the military's unwanted stepchild, the service that got the hardest missions and the worst support. June 1944 brought rising anxiety as rumors of the next operation circulated. The division began receiving intelligence reports on various Pacific targets: Palau Islands, Yap, the Philippines. Nobody knew which would be selected, but everyone understood that the rest period was ending. Training resumed with half-hearted intensity. It was difficult to maintain combat readiness when basic needs weren't being met, when Marines were sick from bad food and exhausted from fighting rats. The division conducted amphibious landing rehearsals using worn-out LVT, amphibious tractors that broke down constantly due to lack of maintenance parts. Tanks sat immobilized, corroding from salt exposure because maintenance facilities didn't exist. Artillery pieces were test-fired to ensure they still functioned. The division was preparing for combat while barely capable of sustaining itself in garrison. Senior officers filed complaints through channels, requesting relief from Pavuvu, or at minimum supplies to make the island habitable. The responses were bureaucratic, supplies were being processed, be patient, make do with what you have. July brought Private First Class Eugene Sledge, a replacement Marine arriving at Pavuvu, with other members of Company K, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Sledge had joined the Marines in December 1942, completed boot camp at San Diego, trained at Camp Elliott, and volunteered for the Pacific Theater. He was 19 years old, educated, from a middle-class Alabama family, exactly the type of idealistic young Marine the Corps attracted. His first view of Pavuvu shattered any romantic notions about military service. He later wrote, "Pavuvu was a stinking, pestilent hole. The heat was oppressive, the humidity stifling, the rain endless. We lived in tents floored with decaying coconuts that bred rats and flies in numbers defying belief. I thought we'd been sent to some tropical hell as punishment." Sledge's perspective was valuable because he represented the 60% of the division who hadn't fought on Guadalcanal, who joined the old breed without having earned that status. His memoir would become the definitive account of Peleliu and Okinawa, capturing the experience of replacement Marines who had to prove themselves to veterans. The relationship between Guadalcanal veterans and replacements remained complex and occasionally hostile. Veterans resented replacements who hadn't earned their place in the division. Replacements resented veterans who treated them with contempt. The hazing was merciless. Veterans sent replacements on impossible errands, mocked their ignorance of combat, reminded them constantly that they hadn't been tested. But underneath the hazing was genuine concern. The veterans knew these replacements would be fighting beside them. That incompetence could get everyone killed. They hazed to test character, to determine who would hold under pressure. The replacements who accepted the hazing without complaint, who demonstrated willingness to learn, who showed respect for combat experience, were gradually accepted. By August 1944, the division had integrated replacements sufficiently that unit cohesion approached pre-Guadalcanal levels. They weren't friends necessarily, but they were Marines, and that identity transcended individual relationships. August brought the operation order and final confirmation of the target, Peleliu, one of the Palau Islands, 1,500 miles east of the Philippines. The briefing described Peleliu as 6 miles long by 2 miles wide, coral limestone with a Japanese airfield on the southern end. Intelligence estimated garrison of approximately 10,000 Japanese troops. Expected resistance was moderate. Planners anticipated securing the island in 4 days, with approximately 3,000 casualties. The Marines who'd fought at Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester heard these estimates with skepticism. Intelligence had been wrong before, drastically wrong at Guadalcanal. But orders were orders. The 1st Marine Division would assault Peleliu on September 15, 1944. They would seize the airfield, neutralize the garrison, and hold the island for MacArthur's Philippines invasion. It sounded straightforward in briefings. The veterans knew better. Every operation sounded straightforward until the first bullet flew. Peleliu would be different, the old hands sensed, though they couldn't articulate how. The island's coral ridges visible in reconnaissance photos looked ominous. But all Pacific islands looked ominous from the air. The Marines loaded their equipment, boarded transports, and sailed from Pavuvu without regret. Anywhere was better than that pestilential island. Even an island held by 10,000 Japanese defenders looked preferable to Pavuvu's rats and rotting coconuts. That calculation would prove tragically wrong. September 15, 1944, 08:32 hours. The ramp of Private First Class Eugene Sledge's LVT Amphibious tractor dropped onto White Beach 1. Peleliu and hell came through the opening. Japanese artillery and mortar fire erupted simultaneously, shells impacting among the landing craft still approaching shore, geysers of coral sand and seawater obscuring everything. Sledge ran down the ramp into water that was waist-deep and boiling from explosions, following the Marine ahead of him, trying to reach the dubious cover of the beach. The LVT next to his took a direct hit from a 75mm shell, disintegrating in a fireball that killed everyone aboard instantly. Burning fuel spread across the water. Marines struggling ashore found themselves wading through flames. Sledge reached the beach and threw himself behind a coral outcrop barely 2 feet high. The outcrop provided psychological comfort, but zero protection from the artillery fire that was systematically destroying the assault waves. This wasn't the unopposed landing of Guadalcanal. This was modern warfare in its purest, most terrible form. Defenders who'd studied American Amphibious Doctrine prepared accordingly, and were now executing a defensive plan that was slaughtering Marines before they got off the beach. The landing beaches at Peleliu ran along the southwestern coast, designated White 1 and 2, Orange 1 and 2. 1st Marines hit White Beach on the left, 5th Marines took Orange Beach center, 7th Marines landed on the right. The assault plan called for rapid penetration inland to seize the airfield within hours. Reality was carnage measured in yards. The Japanese had allowed the Marines to land, holding fire until landing craft were committed and couldn't withdraw. Then they'd opened up with every weapon sighted on the beaches: artillery, mortars, anti-boat guns, machine guns positioned in coral caves with interlocking fields of fire. The Marines had expected some resistance. They'd prepared for beach defenses similar to Cape Gloucester. They found something entirely different, a killing zone where every square yard was pre-registered for artillery fire, where Japanese observers from ridges inland could direct fire onto any Marine position, where the beach itself was designed as a trap. By 0900 hours, 30 minutes after the first wave landed, the beaches were littered with burning Amtraks, shattered landing craft, and Marines who'd been killed before firing a shot. The Point, a coral promontory on the left flank of White Beach, became the focal point of 1st Marines' struggle to get off the beach. The 30-foot coral outcrop had been fortified with interconnected bunkers, firing positions carved into solid rock, all invisible until Marines were within 50 yards. Captain Everett Pope's Company C, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines drew the mission of reducing the point. His company attacked across open ground, swept by machine gun fire from positions they couldn't see, taking casualties with every yard gained. The assault devolved into small unit actions, fire teams suppressing one bunker while another team maneuvered, flamethrowers trying to reach firing slits, demolition teams crawling forward with satchel charges. The point's fortifications were layered in depth. Destroy one bunker, and fire came from another deeper in the complex. Pope's company took 4 hours to advance 200 yards, reaching the point's summit by early afternoon, having lost a third of its strength. The survivors dug in on bare coral, using dead Japanese soldiers as sandbags because there was nothing else available for protection. 1400 hours brought the Japanese counterattack that nearly split the Marine beachhead. Tanks Type 95 light tanks mounting 37mm guns emerged from the airfield area supported by infantry, driving straight at the boundary between 1st and 5th Marines. The Marines had encountered Japanese tanks before but not employed this aggressively. The Type 95s advanced at speed, firing on the move, infantry following in the tank's wake. Marine Shermans were still struggling to get off the beach, immobilized in soft sand or damaged by artillery. The defense fell to individual Marines with bazookas, anti-tank grenades, and desperation. Private First Class Arthur Jackson fired his bazooka at point-blank range, destroying one tank. The crew bailed out. Jackson shot them with his carbine. Another tank ran over a Marine foxhole. The Marine jammed a thermite grenade into the tank's engine deck, burning the vehicle and crew. The Japanese tank attack was beaten back through individual courage and the superior armor of the few Shermans that made it inland. But the attack had revealed how close the beachhead was to collapse. By nightfall on D-Day, the 1st Marine Division held a beachhead barely 600 yards deep at its maximum penetration. Casualties approached 1,000 killed and wounded, nearly double the estimated first-day losses. 48% of the division's LVT amphibious tractors had been destroyed or damaged. The Marines clung to coral outcrops and shell craters, unable to dig foxholes in solid coral, completely exposed to the Japanese artillery that continued firing throughout the night. Medical corpsmen worked under constant fire, treating wounded in shell craters because there was no rear area, no safe zone where casualties could be evacuated. The dead lay where they'd fallen. There was no time or safety to police them up. Marines who'd fought at Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester recognized that Peleliu was different. The Japanese weren't conducting banzai charges or making tactical errors. They were executing a defensive plan that was killing Marines at rates the division couldn't sustain. September 16th brought the realization that intelligence had failed catastrophically. The estimated 10,000 Japanese defenders was accurate, but everything else was wrong. The island wasn't lightly fortified. It was the most heavily fortified position the Marines had yet encountered. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, commanding the Japanese garrison, had spent months preparing Peleliu's defense. He'd abandoned the doctrine of beach defense, which had failed everywhere from Guadalcanal to Saipan, in favor of defense in depth. His troops occupied the Ummerbrogal, a complex of coral ridges honeycombed with caves and tunnels in the island's center. These weren't natural caves, they were engineered fortifications with multiple entrances, ventilation systems, living quarters, ammunition storage, all carved from solid coral. Some caves accommodated company-sized units. Others served as observation posts, providing clear fields of fire across the entire southern end of the island. Nakagawa could observe every American movement, direct artillery fire from protected positions, and shift troops through the tunnel system without exposing them to American fire. He'd created a fortress that negated American advantages in firepower and air support. September 23rd brought the relief of 1st Marines after suffering 1,749 casualties, 60% of regimental strength in 8 days. Colonel Lewis Chesty Puller's regiment had been ground down through continuous assault on the Ummerbrogel ridges, gaining ground measured in yards, paying for every advance with casualties that couldn't be replaced. The survivors who stumbled out of the line looked like Guadalcanal veterans evacuating in December 1942, hollow-eyed, gaunt, psychologically shattered. They'd been in sustained close combat for 8 days, fighting an enemy they couldn't see, attacking positions that were nearly invulnerable to anything except close assault, taking casualties from artillery they couldn't suppress because the guns were hidden in caves. A Navy officer watching 1st Marines evacuate wrote in his diary, "They moved like zombies, not responding to questions, staring at nothing. I've never seen American troops so completely used up." The 1st Marines would not fight again during World War II. The regiment required complete reconstitution. The Ummerbrogel, which Marines called Bloody Nose Ridge for obvious reasons, became the focus of operations through October. 5th and 7th Marines took over the assault, attacking the ridge complex with tactics that were costing approximately 1 Marine killed for every yard gained. The battle became a savage grind, flamethrower teams crawling forward to spray fire into cave mouths, demolition teams sealing caves with explosives after burning out the defenders, riflemen providing covering fire against Japanese soldiers who emerged from unexpected positions. The caves were interconnected. Marines would clear one section only to have Japanese emerge from tunnels behind them. Some positions had to be reduced multiple times. The division developed a systematic approach: reconnaissance to identify cave entrances, flamethrowers to force defenders deep into caves, demolitions to seal entrances, sometimes with defenders still alive inside. It was brutal, methodical, and the only tactic that worked. The heat became as deadly as Japanese fire. Peleliu's temperatures routinely exceeded 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Marines fighting on bare coral, exposed to direct sunlight, carrying 60-pound combat loads, suffered heat exhaustion at rates approaching 15% of combat casualties. Corpsmen treated hundreds of heat casualties daily, pouring water on overheated Marines, evacuating severe cases who'd collapsed into unconsciousness. Water was rationed because bringing it forward through Japanese artillery fire was nearly impossible. Marines learned to function on 1 canteen per day, in temperatures that required a gallon of fluid to maintain physical performance. Dehydration compounded combat stress, reducing Marines to shuffling movements, degrading judgment, causing hallucinations in severe cases. The environmental conditions on Peleliu were worse than Guadalcanal because there was no shade, no relief, no possibility of escape from the relentless heat, radiating from white coral. October 12th brought the final major Japanese counterattack, a night assault from the Ummerbrogel pocket, attempting to break through Marine positions and reach the airfield. Approximately 500 Japanese infantry attacked in coordination, not a banzai charge but a tactically sophisticated infiltration attempt. They penetrated Marine lines in multiple locations, creating confusion, threatening to overrun artillery positions. The defense succeeded through combination of artillery defensive fires, Marine infantry counterattacks, and sheer determination not to yield ground after paying such costs to gain it. By dawn, the Japanese attack had been repulsed with an estimated 300 enemy killed. The Marines had held, but the casualties continued mounting. By mid-October, division casualties exceeded 6,000, one-third of the assault force, and the Ummerbrogel pocket remained contested. The battle had exceeded every planning estimate. 4 days had become 5 weeks. 3,000 casualties had become 6,700. And still the Japanese held positions in the ridges, forcing the Marines to reduce each cave individually. The strategic unnecessity of Peleliu became apparent while the battle raged. Admiral Halsey had recommended canceling the operation in September, arguing that MacArthur's Philippines invasion didn't require Peleliu's airfield. Carriers could provide air support, land-based airfields weren't necessary. But the wheels of war planning ground slowly. The operation had been approved, forces committed, and stopping it would require admitting that thousands of Marines might die for an objective that wasn't strategically necessary. The assault proceeded despite Halsey's recommendation. This decision haunted everyone involved. Marines died taking Peleliu, while the strategic situation that had justified the operation evaporated. MacArthur invaded the Philippines on October 20th, without needing Peleliu's airfield. The Japanese fleet was destroyed at Leyte Gulf, without Peleliu playing any role. The island that cost the 1st Marine Division its combat effectiveness contributed nothing to victory in the Philippines. It was a battle fought because stopping it was too complicated, not because winning it mattered. November 27, 1944. The 1st Marine Division was officially relieved by the Army's 81st Infantry Division, which would continue reducing the Ummerbrugel pocket through late November. The Marines who departed Peleliu had been in combat for 73 days, longer than Guadalcanal. Casualties were staggering: 1,336 killed, 5,450 wounded, 38.8% casualty rate. 1st Marines had been destroyed as a fighting unit. 5th Marines had lost a third of its strength. 7th Marines was barely combat effective. The division had suffered psychological casualties approaching 20% of engaged force, the highest rate in Marine Corps history. These weren't physical casualties. These were Marines who'd broken under sustained combat stress, who couldn't function, who stared at nothing and didn't respond to commands. The division medical officer estimated that an additional 40% were showing symptoms of combat fatigue but remained on duty because they were needed. Peleliu had broken the 1st Marine Division more completely than Guadalcanal, and in less than half the time. The transport ships carrying the 1st Division from Peleliu sailed to Pavu, the rat-infested island they'd left with such relief in August. Returning to Pavu after Peleliu felt like cosmic joke. They'd survived hell to return to purgatory. But at least Pavu's rats couldn't kill them. The Marines disembarked with the mechanical movements of exhausted men, set up their tents in areas they'd occupied before, and tried to process what they'd just survived. Many couldn't. The division's casualty lists included names of Marines who'd survived Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester, only to die on Peleliu. The old breed was being ground away, replaced by men who'd never known the division before Peleliu became its defining trauma. Eugene Sledge would later write that Peleliu was worse than Okinawa, which was saying something given Okinawa's scale and duration. Peleliu had been concentrated horror, 30 days of sustained combat at maximum intensity, fighting an enemy dug into positions that couldn't be destroyed by firepower alone, taking casualties at rates that should have resulted in unit collapse, continuing to attack because orders said attack. The 1st Marine Division had done its duty. The cost was written in casualty lists, medical records, and eyes that had seen too much to ever fully return to peacetime. Peleliu was over. The division was shattered, and somewhere in Pacific Command, staff officers were already planning the next operation, because the war had 10 months remaining and the Corps still needed its premier division, broken or not. October 15th, 1944, the 1st Marine Division's chief medical officer sat in his tent on Peleliu, compiling casualty statistics that would become the most damning report filed during the Pacific War. The numbers were devastating in their precision. 6,786 total casualties from 17,490 engaged, 38.8% casualty rate, over 73 days, 1,336 killed in action, 5,450 wounded, 1,393 combat fatigue casualties. 20% of all casualties were psychiatric rather than physical. The division had been more thoroughly destroyed than after Guadalcanal, despite fighting for less than half the duration. The medical officer's conclusion was stark. The 1st Marine Division was combat ineffective and would require complete reconstitution before undertaking further operations. This report would trigger investigations, recriminations, and doctrinal changes. But none of that would help the men who'd paid the price. The regimental breakdown revealed the cost with brutal clarity. 1st Marines, 1,749 casualties out of 3,000 engaged, 58.3%. The regiment had ceased to exist as a functional organization after 8 days of combat. Companies that had landed with 240 men were down to 40 effectives when relieved. Some platoons had been reduced to squad strength. 1st Marines would require not reconstitution, but complete rebuilding, with new personnel filling positions from fire team leader to company commander. 5th Marines, 1,700 casualties out of approximately 6,000 engaged, 28.3%. Still functional, but severely degraded, with experienced NCOs and officers killed or wounded at rates that destroyed unit cohesion. 7th Marines, 2,377 casualties out of approximately 6,000 engaged, 39.6%. The most reliable regiment in the division had been ground down through continuous combat, losing the combat power that had made it effective. The psychiatric casualties presented the division with a crisis it had no doctrine to address. 1,393 Marines evacuated for combat fatigue meant that 1 in 5 casualties couldn't be explained by bullets or shrapnel. These were Marines who'd simply broken under sustained stress, inability to function, catatonic states, violent responses to minor stimuli, complete emotional shutdown. The psychiatric screening revealed troubling patterns. 75% of combat fatigue casualties were Guadalcanal veterans who'd fought through multiple campaigns. They hadn't broken on Guadalcanal or Cape Gloucester. They'd broken on Peleliu because human beings had limits, and 3 sustained campaigns exceeded those limits. The Marine Corps had assumed that combat experience made Marines more effective, more resilient. Peleliu proved the opposite. Accumulated trauma made veterans more vulnerable to breakdown. The old hands weren't tougher than replacements. They were more damaged, functioning on borrowed psychological capital that Peleliu had exhausted. November 1st, 1944, Pavuvu Island. The division personnel officer compiled replacement requirements, and the numbers were staggering. 8,300 replacements needed to reach authorized strength. That was 43% of the division's entire personnel. It exceeded the replacements required after Guadalcanal. Despite Guadalcanal lasting nearly twice as long, the mathematics revealed an uncomfortable truth. Peleliu's casualty rate per day was triple Guadalcanal's. If the division fought another battle at Peleliu intensity, it would be completely destroyed in approximately 30 days. The Marine Corps couldn't sustain this level of attrition. The 1st Division had paid tuition for lessons that had to be learned. Frontally assaulting fortified positions produced catastrophic casualties regardless of firepower superiority or tactical skill. Future operations would need to account for this reality or accept that divisions were expendable resources. The division's leadership had been gutted. 1st Marines Regimental Commander Colonel Louis Chesty Puller remained physically intact but was professionally finished. His aggressive tactics, which had worked at Guadalcanal's Coffin Corner, had produced a 60% casualty rate at Peleliu without achieving objectives. Senior Marine Corps leadership quietly reassigned Puller to training command, ending his combat career. Battalion commanders in all 3 regiments had been killed or wounded at rates approaching 50%. Company commanders, captains, and 1st lieutenants had been killed or evacuated at even higher rates. The junior officers and NCOs who survived inherited commands 2 levels above their experience. A platoon sergeant might find himself commanding a company. A corporal might be running a platoon. This created units where the men in charge had technical competence but lacked the experience for their responsibilities. Rebuilding the division's leadership would take months because leadership couldn't be manufactured, only developed through training and experience. The comparison with other Peleliu forces revealed the 1st Division's disproportionate burden. The Army's 81st Infantry Division, which relieved the Marines and finished reducing the Omerbrogel pocket, suffered approximately 1,300 casualties over 6 weeks, 1/5 the Marine rate. The difference wasn't courage or competence, it was mission and tactics. The Marines had been given impossible missions, frontal assault on fortified ridges, and had executed them regardless of cost. The Army approached the same positions methodically, using siege tactics, accepting slower progress in exchange for lower casualties. Both approaches eventually succeeded, but one destroyed the attacking force while the other preserved it. Marine Corps doctrine emphasized aggressive action and rapid tempo. Peleliu demonstrated that aggression without tactical flexibility was suicide. December 1944 brought the strategic reassessment that Peleliu's costs demanded. Navy leadership questioned whether frontal amphibious assaults against prepared defenses were sustainable. The casualty rates at Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu suggested that Japanese defensive doctrine had evolved faster than American assault tactics. The Japanese had learned to let Marines land, then destroy them through prepared defenses in depth, where American firepower advantages were negated by terrain and fortifications. If this defensive doctrine spread throughout the Pacific, and intelligence suggested it was, then every remaining operation would be as costly as Peleliu. The Navy began exploring alternatives, siege tactics, instead of assault, carrier air power to isolate objectives and starve them out, accepting longer campaigns to reduce casualties. These discussions were theoretical in December 1944. They would become operational reality at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where the lessons paid for at Peleliu would shape American tactics. The human cost couldn't be captured in statistics. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Buckley, awarded the Navy Cross for his battalion's actions on Peleliu, wrote in his diary, "I have seen men disintegrate under continuous combat stress. They don't collapse dramatically. They erode, losing small pieces of humanity until nothing recognizable remains." By day 20 on Peleliu, my Marines moved like automatons, executing orders without thought, killing without emotion. We'd become a machine for destroying Japanese positions, efficient and pitiless. What we destroyed in the process was ourselves. This assessment from a decorated combat leader captured what the statistics couldn't. Peleliu had dehumanized its participants through sustained exposure to industrial-scale violence. The Marines who survived weren't heroes in any traditional sense. They were damaged men who'd done terrible things because their mission required it, who'd watched friends die for objectives that proved strategically meaningless, who couldn't reconcile their sacrifice with the war's larger narrative. The division's Peleliu veterans developed a dark pride in their accomplishment, the pride of survivors who'd endured what shouldn't be survivable. They'd attacked positions that Doctrine said were impregnable and taken them through sheer determination. They'd sustained 40% casualties and continued attacking. They'd fought in 115-degree heat without adequate water. They'd watched their regiment destroyed and reformed their lines and kept fighting. This wasn't the glory of victory. This was the savage satisfaction of having been tested beyond human limits and not breaking completely. The Peleliu veterans were the old breed's inner circle now. Men who'd survived the worst campaign in division history, whose opinion carried weight that even Guadalcanal veterans respected. But that pride was alloyed with bitterness. They'd accomplished their mission. The mission hadn't needed accomplishing. They'd sacrificed for nothing except bureaucratic inertia, and that realization poisoned everything. The question that haunted everyone involved with Peleliu was simple. Could this have been avoided? Admiral Halsey had recommended canceling the operation. Intelligence had indicated the island was heavily fortified. The strategic necessity was questionable. Yet the operation proceeded, and thousands of Marines paid with their lives, limbs, or sanity. Who was responsible? The planners who selected Peleliu without adequate intelligence? The commanders who executed the plan despite mounting casualties? The operational tempo that didn't allow for mid-course corrections once the campaign began? There were no good answers, only institutional failures that accumulated into catastrophe. The Marine Corps would study Peleliu for decades, extracting tactical lessons about cave warfare and defense in depth. But the strategic lesson that some operations shouldn't be undertaken regardless of tactical feasibility never quite penetrated institutional consciousness. The Corps prided itself on accomplishing impossible missions. Peleliu was the impossible mission that succeeded tactically while failing strategically, and that contradiction would haunt the 1st Marine Division for the remainder of the war. They'd proven they could take any objective. The question nobody wanted to confront was whether they should. April 1st, 1945, 08:30 hours, Easter Sunday. The 1st Marine Division's landing craft approached Hagushi beaches on Okinawa's western coast, and the Marines braced for the slaughter they knew was coming. Peleliu had taught them what modern Japanese defensive doctrine meant, allowing unopposed landings, then destroying attackers through prepared defenses inland. Every Marine expected the worst. The ramps dropped, they charged ashore, and found empty beaches. Not a shot fired, not a single Japanese soldier visible. 60,000 American troops, 1st and 6th Marine Divisions. 4 Army divisions came ashore on a 10,000-yard front without opposition. By noon, the beachhead extended 2 miles inland. Marines who'd fought at Peleliu couldn't believe it. This was the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War, and the Japanese weren't contesting the landing. It made no tactical sense, but it made perfect strategic sense, as the Marines would learn over the next 82 days of the bloodiest sustained combat in the Pacific theater. Okinawa dwarfed every previous operation in scale and strategic importance. The island measured 60 miles long by 18 miles wide, populated by nearly 500,000 Okinawan civilians, defended by 100,000 Japanese troops under Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima. It was the last major stepping stone before the Japanese home islands, close enough that B-29 bombers could reach Tokyo, large enough to stage the entire American invasion force for the assault on Japan itself. The Japanese understood Okinawa's importance perfectly. They didn't intend to hold the island, they intended to make its capture so costly that the Americans would reconsider invading Japan. Ushijima had studied American tactics, identified their weaknesses, and created a defensive plan that would exploit those weaknesses maximally. He'd withdrawn his forces to southern Okinawa, to the Shuri Line, a defensive complex centered on Shuri Castle, and prepared to bleed the Americans white. The 1st Marine Division moved north initially, securing the upper two-thirds of the island against minimal opposition. This was police work rather than combat, clearing villages, checking caves, securing terrain against an enemy that had already withdrawn. 5th and 7th Marines, reconstituted since Peleliu with thousands of replacements, moved through Okinawan countryside that looked almost peaceful. Terraced rice paddies, small villages, stone tombs built into hillsides. The civilians complicated operations in ways the Marines hadn't experienced on other islands. Okinawans weren't Japanese ethnically or culturally. They'd been absorbed into the Japanese Empire in the 19th century and still maintained distinct identity. Many spoke no Japanese. Some welcomed the Americans as liberators from Japanese rule. Others had been convinced by Japanese propaganda that Americans would torture and kill them. Thousands committed suicide rather than be captured, jumping from cliffs or detonating grenades in family groups. Marines watched these suicides helplessly, unable to prevent them, unable to convince terrified civilians that surrender meant safety. April 30th brought 1st Division's introduction to the real battle. The division moved south to relieve the 27th Infantry Division, taking position on the western end of the Shuri Line. What they found was unlike anything they'd encountered. The Japanese had created a defensive system that used every feature of Okinawa's terrain: limestone caves, stone tombs, terraced hillsides, ancient walls. Every position was mutually supporting. Artillery was sited in caves with overhead cover-proof against American bombs and shells. Infantry occupied bunkers with multiple exits, allowing defenders to withdraw through tunnels when a position was threatened, then reoccupy it after the Americans moved on. Machine guns were positioned to create interlocking fire across every approach. The Shuri Line wasn't a line in the traditional sense. It was a defensive zone 5 miles deep, where every yard was contested, where Americans could gain ground during the day and lose it at night to Japanese infiltration. May 11th through May 18th, the Battle of Withdrew became the 1st Division's bloodiest week of the war. 1st Battalion, 5th Marines drew the mission of securing Wana Ridge, a coral escarpment overlooking a deep ravine the Marines called Withdrew. The ridge was honeycombed with caves sheltering Japanese infantry and artillery observers who could direct fire across the entire sector. The battalion attacked repeatedly, gaining the ridge crest by day, losing it to Japanese counterattacks by night. The attacks followed a brutal pattern: artillery preparation, infantry assault, hand-to-hand fighting in caves, Japanese counterattacks from tunnels, withdrawal to starting positions by dawn, 8 days to advance 500 yards. 1st Battalion lost over 40% of its strength, including 3 company commanders killed and 2 wounded. The survivors described Withdrew as worse than Peleliu because the fighting was sustained longer, at similar intensity, without respite. The Japanese employed tactics designed specifically to negate American firepower advantages. Artillery was positioned in caves too deep for American shells to penetrate. When Americans called in artillery fire, Japanese observers withdrew into tunnels, waited for the barrage to end, then reoccupied positions before American infantry could assault. Infantry occupied reverse-slope positions invisible to American observers, engaging only when Americans crested ridges at point-blank range. Machine guns were sited to create grazing fire across open ground, forcing Marines to cross killing zones with no cover. The Japanese had learned from their defeats on previous islands. American firepower could destroy exposed positions, but couldn't destroy covered positions, and patience could offset American material superiority. Ushijima wasn't trying to win tactically. He was trading space for time, accepting slow withdrawal in exchange for maximum American casualties. The strategy worked horrifically well. May 21st brought rain that wouldn't stop for 5 weeks. Okinawa's terrain, coral limestone covered with thin topsoil, turned into liquid mud under the deluge. Foxholes filled with water faster than Marines could bail them out. Tanks bogged down in mud so deep that recovery vehicles couldn't extract them. Supply routes became impassable. Ammunition and rations had to be hand-carried forward by Marines who sank knee-deep with every step. Corpsmen couldn't evacuate wounded from forward positions. Casualties lay in mud-filled shell holes for hours or days before stretcher bearers could reach them. The rain added environmental torture to combat stress. Marines went weeks without dry clothing, without hot food, without sleep in anything except waterlogged foxholes. Trench foot became epidemic, thousands of cases requiring evacuation. Fungal infections covered every exposed skin surface. The rain didn't stop combat, it made combat more miserable while maintaining the same deadly intensity. June 17, 1945, 5th Marines reached the southern coast of Okinawa, marking the official end of organized Japanese resistance. The Shuri Line had been breached after 6 weeks of sustained combat. Lieutenant General Ushijima and his staff committed suicide in a command cave rather than surrender. The victory was complete in tactical terms. The cost was appalling. 1st Marine Division casualties: 1,655 killed, 7,316 wounded, 36 missing, approximately 130 psychological casualties evacuated. Total casualties: 9,107 from approximately 17,000 engaged, 53.6% casualty rate, over 82 days. This exceeded even Peleliu's rate. The division had fought longer, harder, and at greater cost than any previous campaign. And unlike Peleliu, Okinawa couldn't be questioned strategically. The island was necessary for the invasion of Japan. Every casualty, however terrible, served strategic purpose. The comparison between 1st Division's Okinawa performance and its earlier campaigns revealed institutional learning and human limits. The tactics were more sophisticated: combined arms integration, methodical reduction of fortified positions, use of flamethrower tank demolition teams refined through experience. The Marines made fewer tactical errors than at Peleliu or Guadalcanal. They were more professional, more skilled, better supported, yet casualties were higher because the Japanese had also learned, had created defenses that negated tactical skill. The result was industrial warfare at its most brutal. 2 competent forces locked in attritional combat, where victory went to whoever could sustain losses longer. The Marines could sustain their losses because replacements continued arriving from the United States. The Japanese couldn't. Their garrison was fixed, declining daily, heading toward inevitable extinction. But mathematical inevitability didn't reduce the cost to individual Marines, who died taking one more cave, one more ridge, one more position in a campaign that lasted almost 3 months. The psychological toll of sustained combat manifested in ways the division had never experienced. Marines developed the 1,000-yard stare after 2 weeks on the Shuri Line, the blank expression of men who'd seen too much, processed too much trauma, shut down emotionally as survival mechanism. Corpsmen reported Marines who stopped caring about personal safety, who took unnecessary risks, who sought death consciously or unconsciously. Others became hypervigilant, jumping at sudden noises, unable to sleep despite exhaustion, firing at shadows. The division's psychiatric casualty rate, approximately 130 evacuated cases, dramatically understated the problem, because most Marines exhibiting combat fatigue symptoms remained on duty. An Army psychiatric study of Okinawa combat units found that 85% of personnel showed some level of combat stress reaction after 60 days of sustained operations. The Marines had been fighting for 82 days. Everyone was damaged to some degree. The campaign ended with whimper rather than triumph. Marines who'd fought for 12 weeks securing Okinawa watched the island transform into a massive logistics base for the planned invasion of Japan. Operation Olympic, scheduled for November 1, 1945. They saw construction battalions building airfields, supply dumps growing, replacement units arriving. Everyone understood what came next: the Japanese home islands, where 100 million people had been told to resist to the death, where casualties would make Okinawa look moderate by comparison. The Marines of the 1st Division, veterans of 4 major campaigns, knew they'd be part of Olympic. They'd survived Guadalcanal, Cape Gloucester, Peleliu, Okinawa, they'd be expected to survive the invasion of Japan. The probability mathematics suggested otherwise. A Marine who'd fought in all 4 campaigns had approximately a 5% chance of surviving a 5th. The division began preparing for Olympic with the fatalism of men who knew they were already dead, just hadn't received the paperwork yet. Then on August 6, 1945, everything changed. August 15, 1945, Okinawa. Private First Class Eugene Sledge sat in his tent cleaning his rifle when word spread through Company K, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. The Japanese had surrendered. Someone had dropped an atomic bomb, whatever that was, on 2 Japanese cities, and the Emperor had announced unconditional surrender. The war was over. Sledge waited for euphoria, for celebration, for some emotional response to survival when death had seemed inevitable. He felt nothing. Most of the Marines around him felt nothing. They sat in their tents, continued cleaning weapons, stared at nothing. A few men cried quietly. Others walked away from camp, needing to be alone. There were no celebrations, no cheering, nothing like the newsreels would later show of Americans dancing in Times Square. The Marines who'd fought across the Pacific for 4 years were too numb, too damaged, too exhausted to celebrate. They'd survived, that was all. The relief of survival didn't erase the memories, didn't resurrect the dead, didn't make the last 4 years worthwhile. It just meant the killing had stopped. The 1st Marine Division's war had ended with statistical finality that captured nothing of individual experience. 4,311 Marines killed in action across 4 campaigns. 18,948 wounded. Total casualties, 23,259, from a division that had turned over its entire personnel multiple times since Guadalcanal. 1,609 days overseas, the longest deployment of any Marine division. 278 days in sustained combat. 9 months of actual fighting spread across 4 years. The division had participated in 4 of the Pacific War's bloodiest campaigns: Guadalcanal, Cape Gloucester, Peleliu, Okinawa. It had taken more casualties than any other Marine division. It had also accomplished more, establishing the tactical and operational patterns that would define Marine Corps doctrine for decades. The 1st Division was the institutional memory of the Pacific War, the unit where lessons were learned first, usually through painful trial and error, then transmitted to the rest of the Marine Corps. August 20th brought the memorial service at Macon Cemetery on Okinawa, where the division's dead from that campaign lay buried. Chaplain Father Keogh conducted the service, reading names of Marines killed in action, reminding survivors of the cost of victory. 4,311 names took 45 minutes to read. The Marines stood in formation listening to their friends' names, trying to remember faces, remembering last conversations, remembering how they died. Some names sparked clear memories: the squad leader killed at Peleliu, the fire team member who'd survived Guadalcanal only to die on Okinawa. Other names were just names, faces forgotten, casualties from the earlier campaigns when the division had contained different Marines. The service was meant to honor the dead. It reminded survivors that they'd lost more comrades than many divisions had personnel. The grief was cumulative, too vast to process, so the Marines stood silently and let the chaplain's words wash over them without penetrating. September 2, 1945, the 1st Division's surviving Marines gathered around radios or watched newsreel footage of the surrender ceremony aboard USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. General Douglas MacArthur signed for the Allied powers, Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signed for Japan, and the Pacific War officially ended. The ceremony was meant to be historic, symbolic, a moment of triumph. For the Marines watching from Okinawa, it was distant and disconnected from their experience. The admirals and generals signing documents hadn't stormed beaches or cleared caves. They hadn't watched friends die for coral outcrops that didn't appear on maps. The ceremonial ending bore no relationship to the messy, violent, personal ending that each Marine had experienced when the shooting stopped in his particular sector. The war ended differently for everyone who'd fought it. For the 1st Division, the war had ended in increments. When your enlistment was up, when you were wounded badly enough for evacuation, when you died, and your war ended permanently. September 22nd brought new orders that few Marines welcomed. The 1st Division would deploy to North China for occupation duty. The war might be over, but the division's deployment wasn't. They'd occupy Tientsin and Tsingtao, major cities in northern China, maintaining order during the transition from Japanese occupation to Chinese sovereignty. The mission was ambiguous: protect Japanese civilians from Chinese reprisals while disarming Japanese military forces, while avoiding involvement in the emerging Chinese Civil War between nationalists and communists. It was peacekeeping rather than combat, but it required the division to remain overseas, deployed, separated from families while army divisions went home. The Marines accepted the orders with resignation. Of course they'd be kept overseas. Of course the Corps would get occupation duty while the army demobilized. The Marines were the nation's stepchildren in peace, as in war, getting the missions nobody else wanted, staying deployed while others went home. The China occupation revealed how thoroughly the war had changed the Marines. They entered Chinese cities as conquering troops, but felt more like exhausted survivors stumbling through surreal aftermath. Tonson was a cosmopolitan city, largely undamaged, where Japanese civilians bowed to Marine patrols, where Chinese civilians regarded Americans with hope mixed with calculation. The Marines occupied hotels, established headquarters in former Japanese buildings, tried to transition from combat mode to occupation. It wasn't working. Marines trained for 4 years to kill Japanese, suddenly had to protect them from Chinese mobs seeking revenge. The psychological whiplash was severe. Some Marines couldn't make the adjustment. They saw Japanese civilians and remembered combat, remembered friends killed, wanted revenge. Others adapted quickly, recognizing that Japanese civilians had no more chosen the war than Marines had. The occupation duty was easier than combat, but harder psychologically, requiring emotional flexibility from men who'd spent years learning to suppress emotion. October 1945 brought Eugene Sledge's reflection in a letter home, capturing the division's collective state. "We didn't conquer Japan, we just stayed alive longer than they did. There's no glory in what we did, nothing noble. We killed and survived, and the killing stopped before we died. That's all. Now we're supposed to go home and pretend we're normal Americans. That 4 years of this didn't change us. But we're not normal and never will be. The war destroyed everyone it touched, winners and losers. We survived, which is better than the alternative, but we're carrying Guadalcanal and Peleliu and Okinawa inside us forever. Those islands are in our heads, and we'll never really leave them." Sledge's assessment was bleaker than official histories would allow, but more honest than most victory narratives. The 1st Division had won its war. The cost was psychological damage that would last lifetimes. The division's decorations reflected extraordinary service. 2 Medals of Honor awarded to division members during the war, 7 Navy Crosses, 118 Silver Stars, 1,425 Bronze Stars, 4,511 Purple Hearts, 4 Presidential Unit citations for actions at Guadalcanal, Cape Gloucester, Peleliu, and Okinawa. These decorations represented institutional recognition of individual courage and collective achievement. But decorations didn't capture what the Marines had actually done. They'd invented modern amphibious warfare through trial and error at Guadalcanal. They'd proven that jungle warfare could be sustained through proper logistics at Cape Gloucester. They'd demonstrated the cost of assaulting prepared defenses at Peleliu. They'd fought the Pacific War's longest and bloodiest land campaign at Okinawa. They'd served as the institutional laboratory where the Marine Corps learned to fight modern war, and they'd paid tuition in blood for every lesson. The demobilization began in November 1945, processing Marines for discharge based on point system that rewarded combat time and decorations. Guadalcanal veterans who'd survived the entire war had enough points for immediate discharge. They left first, heading home to America they hadn't seen in 4 years, to families who'd aged while they'd fought, to civilian lives they no longer fit into. Later casualties went home as they accumulated points. The 1st Division slowly dissolved, its personnel trickling back to the United States while the unit remained in China with skeleton crews. By April 1946, most war-era Marines had gone home. The division was reconstituted with occupation troops who'd never fought, who inherited the division's history and traditions without having earned them through combat. The transition was jarring, the old breed departing, replaced by new Marines who wore the same uniform but had fundamentally different experiences. The division's return to the United States in 1946 was anticlimactic. There were no parades, no civic celebrations, no public recognition. The Marines filtered back individually through discharge centers, received mustering out pay and separation documents, disappeared into civilian America. Some returned to families and civilian careers, successfully transitioning from combat to peacetime. Others struggled, unable to find jobs, unable to relate to civilians who hadn't fought, unable to explain 4 years that defied explanation. Some turned to alcohol to silence the memories. Others isolated themselves, unable to trust or connect. The visible wounds healed. The invisible wounds never did. The 1st Division's veterans carried Guadalcanal, Peleliu, and Okinawa for the rest of their lives. Some lived well despite the memories. Others were destroyed by them slowly, casualties of war that took decades to die. The division had survived the Pacific War. Its veterans spent lifetimes determining what survival meant. The question that haunted the 1st Division's World War II veterans was simple. Had it mattered? They'd fought 4 years, taken 23,000 casualties, captured islands that now appeared in history books as strategic necessities. Guadalcanal had stopped Japanese expansion toward Australia. Cape Gloucester had isolated Rabaul. Peleliu's purpose remained unclear even in victory. Okinawa had been essential for the planned invasion of Japan that never occurred. Did their sacrifice accomplish anything the atomic bombs didn't render moot? There were no good answers, only the certainty that 4,000 Marines died, 18,000 were wounded, and everyone who served was changed. The strategic calculus was beyond individual comprehension. The Marines had been given missions and had accomplished them at terrible cost. Whether the missions needed accomplishing was for historians to debate. For the veterans, the meaning was personal and immediate. They'd served with courage, they'd done their duty, they'd survived when better Marines didn't. That would have to be enough, because that's all they had. April 1st, 1946, Camp Pendleton, California. The 1st Marine Division reactivated as a permanent Marine Corps organization, the only division granted that distinction. Most Marine divisions were deactivated after World War II, their personnel discharged, their colors cased. The 1st Division, in recognition of its war record, became the Corps' active division, stationed at Pendleton, ready for rapid deployment. The symbolism was clear. The 1st Division represented Marine Corps identity, embodied institutional values, carried forward traditions earned in 4 years of Pacific combat. New Marines joined the division knowing they inherited legacy heavier than most could bear. They wore the shoulder patch, a blue diamond with red numeral 1 and Southern Cross constellation that Guadalcanal veterans had worn. They occupied barracks named for Marines killed at Peleliu. They trained on ranges dedicated to Medal of Honor recipients. The old breed's ghost haunted every formation, every training exercise, every deployment. The division had become larger than the Marines who'd served in it. It had become mythology. June 25, 1950 brought test of whether mythology translated to combat effectiveness. North Korea invaded South Korea, and the United Nations authorized military response. The 1st Marine Division, reconstituted since World War II, with mostly occupation troops and peacetime recruits, deployed to Korea in August. The division's first mission was Incheon Landing, on September 15, 1950, exactly 5 years after Peleliu. The amphibious assault succeeded spectacularly, despite terrible conditions, 30-foot tides, seawalls requiring scaling ladders, urban combat in a major city. The success validated doctrines developed during World War II. The Marines who'd learned amphibious warfare at Guadalcanal and refined it through 3 subsequent campaigns had created techniques that worked even when the original old breed had moved on. The institutional knowledge had survived personnel turnover. This was the 1st Division's real legacy, not individual heroism, but systematic transmission of combat knowledge across generations. 1981 brought publication of Eugene Sledge's memoir, With the Old Breed, at Peleliu and Okinawa. Sledge had waited 36 years to write about his war, struggling for decades with memories he couldn't process or express. His book became the definitive infantry-level account of the Pacific War, describing combat with unflinching honesty that official histories avoided. Sledge didn't glorify combat or pretend killing was noble. He described it as necessary horror, duty fulfilled at terrible psychological cost, survival achieved through luck, and minor decisions that determined who lived and who died. The book resonated with Vietnam veterans who recognized Sledge's account as authentic in ways that heroic narratives weren't. With the Old Breed became required reading at Marine Corps schools, not for tactical lessons, but for its honest portrayal of what combat did to the Marines who fought it. Sledge had captured the Old Breed's reality, They were ordinary men who'd endured extraordinary circumstances and been permanently changed. 2010 brought HBO's miniseries The Pacific, based partly on Sledge's memoir, introducing the 1st Division's World War II experience to a generation that knew nothing of Guadalcanal or Peleliu. The series depicted combat with graphic accuracy that shocked viewers accustomed to sanitized war movies. It showed Marines killing Japanese soldiers at close range, witnessing atrocities, committing their own violations of combat ethics, breaking psychologically under sustained stress. Critics debated whether the series was too violent, too honest, too critical of American forces. The veterans who'd survived Peleliu and Okinawa said it was accurate. The series didn't glorify their war. It showed war as they'd experienced it. Brutal, morally ambiguous, psychologically destructive. The Pacific ensured that the 1st Division's World War II service would be remembered, even if the memory was uncomfortable. The division's historical assessment reveals why it holds unique position in Marine Corps mythology. It fought first, establishing patterns subsequent divisions would follow. It fought longest, deploying overseas before Pearl Harbor and remaining deployed through China occupation. It fought hardest, taking more casualties than any other Marine division, while winning every engagement. This combination of firsts, duration, and casualties created legacy that other divisions couldn't match. The 2nd Marine Division fought heroically at Tarawa. The 3rd Division took Iwo Jima. The 4th Division served with distinction throughout the Central Pacific, but none matched the 1st Division's cumulative record. It was the institutional memory of the Pacific War, the unit where the Marine Corps learned to fight modern amphibious warfare through trial and error, purchasing knowledge with blood that benefited the entire Corps. The tactical innovations developed by the 1st Division became Fleet Marine Force Doctrine. Combined arms integration, infantry, artillery, tanks, and air support operating as coordinated system was refined through the division's campaigns. Defensive Operations Doctrine, codified after Edson's Ridge and Coffin Corner, remained Marine Corps standard through Vietnam. Amphibious assault procedures developed through Wellington's disaster and refined at Cape Gloucester became the template for every subsequent landing. Cave warfare tactics created at Peleliu enabled Marine success at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. These weren't theoretical contributions. They were practical techniques purchased through combat experience and validated through subsequent success. The 1st Division's World War II service created the tactical foundation for modern Marine Corps operations. The human cost of creating that legacy remains staggering when examined in detail. 4,311 Marines killed, represented families destroyed, futures erased, potential unfulfilled. The dead ranged from 18-year-old privates to career officers, from recipients of Medal of Honor to Marines whose names appeared only in casualty lists. Each death was individual tragedy replicated thousands of times. The 18,948 wounded carried visible scars that lasted lifetimes, amputations, disfigurements, chronic pain from injuries that never fully healed. The psychological casualties couldn't be quantified because most were never officially diagnosed. Tens of thousands of Marines returned home, carrying trauma that manifested in decades of nightmares, failed relationships, substance abuse, inability to function in civilian life. The division's casualty lists captured only the immediate damage. The long-term cost was written in broken lives across America for the remainder of the 20th century. The strategic verdict on the 1st Division's World War II service is unambiguous. Guadalcanal was essential. If the Japanese had completed Henderson Field and operated bombers from that base, they would have interdicted Allied supply lines to Australia, possibly forcing Australian capitulation. The 1st Division's defense of Henderson Field prevented that catastrophe, making Guadalcanal the strategic turning point of the Pacific War. Cape Gloucester contributed to Rabaul's neutralization, though its necessity remains debatable. Peleliu's strategic value was nearly zero. The operation should have been cancelled but proceeded due to bureaucratic inertia. Okinawa was absolutely necessary for the planned invasion of Japan, and served essential purpose even after atomic bombs rendered that invasion unnecessary. 3 of 4 campaigns served clear strategic purpose. The division's service was justified by results, even if individual operations varied in necessity. The 1st Division's World War II veterans created a specific cultural identity that persisted long after they departed. The old breed, Sledge's phrase, became shorthand for World War II Marine Corps culture: aggressive, self-reliant, contemptuous of weakness, bonded through shared suffering. This identity was partly self-mythology, veterans romanticizing their experience in retrospect. But it was also earned identity, paid for through 4 years of sustained combat operations that tested and validated every claim to toughness. The old breed weren't better Marines than those who served before or after. They were the Marines who defined what it meant to be a Marine through the Pacific War's crucible. Their legend influenced Marine Corps recruitment and training for decades. Young men joined the Corps wanting to prove themselves worthy of the old breed. Drill instructors invoked Guadalcanal and Peleliu as standards of endurance. The World War II 1st Division became the measuring stick for all subsequent Marine performance. The division's present-day legacy remains visible at Camp Pendleton, where street names commemorate World War II battles, where buildings honor individual heroes, where monuments mark the division's history. New Marines joining the 1st Division learn they're entering an organization with 80-plus years of history, with traditions dating to Guadalcanal, with standards established by Marines who fought when defeat meant death. This institutional memory creates burden and inspiration simultaneously. The burden, living up to impossible standards set by men who survived impossible circumstances. The inspiration, belonging to organization that has proven itself in every test, that carries history of success purchased through sacrifice. The 1st Division today is fundamentally different from the World War II organization. Different weapons, different doctrine, different enemies, but the identity remains constant. The Marine Corps' premier division, defined by its World War II service, carrying forward traditions established when the Pacific War's outcome hung in balance. The final assessment of the 1st Marine Division's World War II service is simple. They saved the Pacific theater through competence, courage, and willingness to accept casualties other forces wouldn't sustain. Guadalcanal stopped Japanese expansion. Cape Gloucester isolated their strongest base. Peleliu demonstrated American willingness to pay any price for victory. Okinawa proved that no Japanese position was impregnable. These campaigns, fought by Marines who averaged 22 years old, determined the Pacific War's outcome as surely as carrier battles or strategic bombing. The 1st Division's contribution was ground combat executed with professionalism that evolved across 4 campaigns, learning from failures, codifying successes, creating doctrines that remain relevant decades later. They were ordinary Americans who accomplished extraordinary things, not because they were exceptional people, but because they were placed in circumstances that demanded exceptionalism or death. Most survived. All were changed. Their service created the modern Marine Corps and established standards that define Marine identity today. The old breed earned their legend through blood and determination. Their legacy is the United States Marine Corps, as it exists now, aggressive, competent, willing to fight anyone anywhere, confident in its ability to accomplish impossible missions because Marines from the 1st Division proved it could be done. That's the ultimate legacy. They showed what was possible, and the Marine Corps has been trying to live up to that example ever since.